Tonight, let us travel together slowly and without hurry to an island set in a wide and gentle sea, in a time so long ago that the Greece you may have heard of, the Greece of marble temples and white-columned cities, had not yet been dreamed. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, no task that cannot keep until the morning. You can let the words settle over you like soft dust in warm evening light and let yourself drift down, gently and without effort, towards sleep, while the island of Crete rises out of the blue before you, low and green and warm. This is the story of the Minoans, the first great civilization of Europe, and of the palace of Knossos, where their world reached its height. Picture, if you will, a long island lying east to west across the southern reach of the Aegean Sea, a spine of gray mountains running down its length, their flanks falling away into valleys soft with olive and cypress and vine. This is Crete. To the north lies the scattered web of Greek islands, and beyond them the rocky mainland. To the south, across open water, the long coast of Egypt. To the east, the harbors of the Levant and the cities of Asia. Crete sits in the middle of all of it, a great green stepping stone in the sea, catching the trade and the wind and the warmth of 3 continents at once. And it is here, on a low hill above a quiet valley not far from the northern shore, that one of the most remarkable peoples of the ancient world built their home. We call them the Minoans, though that was not their name for themselves. Their own name for themselves we do not know, for their writing has kept its secrets. The name we use was given to them, thousands of years later, by the man who first dug their palace out of the earth, and he took it from the old Greek legend of King Minos, the king who was said to have ruled at Knossos in the dim ages before history. So we call them Minoans, after a king out of a story, because the people themselves left us no name we can read, but they left us a great deal else. Let us go first to the palace, for the palace is the heart of everything. Picture a hillside above a valley, the air heavy with the scent of wild thyme and sun-warmed stone. The sea lies far off and shining, a band of silver beneath a sky that has slowly gone the color of ripe apricots. And here, spread across the gentle slopes, stands a palace unlike any you have seen. It is not a fortress, not a place of high walls and watchtowers, but a sprawling, sunlit maze of rooms and courtyards, of red columns wider at the top than at the base, of staircases that turn and double back upon themselves like a slow and dreaming thought. There are open light wells that drop the sun down through the upper floors into the cool rooms below, and broad terraces, and a great central court paved with stone where the whole life of the place seems to gather. This is Knossos, the great house of the Minoans, and in its prime it held perhaps 1,000 rooms and rose 4 or 5 stories into the bright air. It did not begin so grand. On this same hill people had lived for a very long time, farming the valley and keeping their flocks, building and rebuilding their homes upon the same rise of ground, until the rise itself was made partly of the broken houses of their ancestors. Around 4,000 years ago, in the centuries the historians call the Middle Bronze Age, the first true palaces rose on Crete, at Knossos and at Phaistos and at Malia and elsewhere. Great complexes of storerooms and workshops and ceremonial halls gathered about a central court. These first palaces were thrown down, perhaps by earthquakes, for Crete is a land that trembles, and the Minoans built them up again grander than before. The Knossos whose ruins we can walk today is mostly this second palace, raised after the first had fallen in the bright noon of Minoan power some 36 centuries ago. The palace was a marvel of quiet cleverness. Beneath its floors ran channels of clay, fitted together in tapering sections so the water flowed swift and clean, carrying fresh water in and rain water and waste away, so that even in the heat of summer the great house stayed cool and sweet. There were stone-lined drains beneath the courts and basins and rooms set aside for washing, plumbing of a kind that would not be seen again in Europe for thousands of years. There were storerooms, long galleries lined with enormous jars, taller than a person, their bellies wide enough to swallow a year's harvest, holding grain and olive oil and wine enough to feed a multitude through the lean months. The floors of those storerooms were honeycombed with stone-lined pits where still more was kept. To stand among those jars is to understand that Knossos was not only a dwelling, but a great gathering place for the wealth of the whole surrounding land, a center where the produce of 100 farms was brought in, counted, stored, and given out again. There were workshops, too, where craftsmen shaped gold into delicate bees and pendants, where lapidaries cut seal stones the size of a fingernail with images of lions and octopuses and lilies, where potters spun cups so thin and fine the light shone through their walls. The Minoans loved beautiful things, and they had the wealth to make them, and the long peace in which to enjoy them. And how they loved to paint. Walk now in your mind through the cool shaded corridors of Knossos, and let your eye travel along the smooth painted plaster. Here a long procession of slender figures carries offerings, cups and vessels held before them, their dark hair falling in long curls down their backs, their skin glowing against backgrounds of warm ochre and deep sea blue. Here leap dolphins, blue and gold, curving through a painted sea among darting fish and pale anemones, on the wall of a room that may have belonged to a queen. Here sit ladies in fine flounced dresses, their gowns layered in tiers of bright color, watching some event we can no longer see, painted with such liveliness that the Frenchmen who first saw them called them, fondly, the little Parisians. And here in a brighter room, young figures vault and tumble over the back of a great charging bull, frozen forever in their joyful, fearless dance. There is little that is grim in these paintings, little of dread or of war. There are flowers and birds and monkeys gathering saffron. There are blue dolphins and leaping fish. There is the world set down as a thing of color and movement and delight by people who seem to have found their days good. The colors themselves tell us something. The Minoans painted while the plaster was still wet, so that the color sank into the wall and held fast for ages, a technique the Italians would one day call fresco. They ground their pigments from the earth and the sea, ochre and iron for the reds and yellows, a precious blue from imported stone and from heated copper, black from soot and from manganese, and they laid them on with a sure and joyful hand. Now let us speak of how all this was found again, for the palace lay buried and forgotten for more than 3,000 years, and the manner of its rediscovery is itself a part of the story. There had always been legends. The old Greeks remembered Crete as the seat of King Minos, the great sea king, and they told of the labyrinth he built beneath his palace, and of the strange creature kept within it. Travelers in later centuries knew there was a low mound near the northern coast where the ancient city was said to have stood, and broken pottery and great storage jars came up out of the ground. But it was only at the very turn of the 20th century that the mound gave up its secret. An Englishman named Arthur Evans, a scholar of antiquities with a sharp eye and a long purse, came to Crete in search of the seals and inscribed stones he had been collecting, small carved gems that bore a writing no one could read. The trail of those little stones led him to the mound at Knossos. He bought the land, and in the spring of the year 1900 he set his workmen to dig. What came out of the earth astonished him. Within days the picks were striking painted walls and the tops of great jars and the bases of red columns, and within a few seasons Evans had uncovered a palace of 1,000 rooms, a whole lost civilization that no one had known to look for. He gave it the name Minoan after the legendary king, and he spent the rest of his long life and a great part of his fortune digging and studying and rebuilding it. For Evans did not merely uncover Knossos, he restored it, pouring concrete columns where the wooden ones had rotted away, raising up the upper floors, repainting the frescoes from the surviving fragments. Scholars argue to this day over how much of what a visitor sees at Knossos is truly Minoan, and how much is Evans's own imagining of it, his guess at how the rooms had looked. He was a man of his age, confident and free-handed with his reconstructions. Yet without him the palace might still lie buried, and it was Evans who first showed the world that long before classical Greece, long before Athens and Sparta were anything at all, there had flourished here on Crete a civilization of extraordinary refinement and grace. The little carved seals that had first drawn Evans to Crete held a writing, and that writing is one of the great unsolved riddles the Minoans left behind. They had, in fact, more than one script. The earliest was a kind of picture writing, small signs like tiny drawings. From it there developed a flowing script of lines and strokes that we call linear A, scratched onto clay tablets and painted on cups and carved into offering tables. Thousands of these signs survive, and scholars have worked at them for more than a century, and still no one can read linear A. We can sound out some of the signs, for a later script used many of the same shapes, but the language beneath them remains locked away. The words of the Minoans, their prayers and their accounts, and whatever names they called themselves, lie just on the far side of understanding, visible but silent. There was a second script later, which we call linear B, and that one has been read. It was deciphered in the middle of the 20th century by a young English architect named Michael Ventris, who proved, to general astonishment, that the language hidden in linear B was an early form of Greek, but Linear B was not the language of the Minoans themselves. It belonged to the Greek-speaking people of the mainland, who in the later days came to Crete and used the old Minoan script to write their own tongue. So the writing that can be read is Greek, and the writing that is truly Minoan cannot be read at all. The Minoans speak to us only through their images, their dolphins and their lilies and their dancing figures, and through the silent shapes of a language we may never recover. Let us turn now to the old legend, for it grew from a seed of truth, and the truth is more interesting than the story. The Greeks told that King Minos of Knossos kept beneath his palace a vast labyrinth, a maze of winding passages from which no one who entered could find the way out, and that within it dwelt the Minotaur, a monster with the body of a man and the head of a bull, to whom young men and women were sent as a terrible tribute. It is a dark and famous tale. But consider the palace itself, that sprawling maze of 1,000 rooms, its corridors turning and doubling back, its staircases climbing and descending around the light wells, a building so complex that a stranger might truly lose his way within it. Consider, too, the word the Greeks used. The labyrinth may take its name from the labres, the double-headed axe, a sacred symbol carved again and again upon the stones of Knossos, on the pillars of its holiest rooms, the house of the double axe. It is easy to imagine how, in the long centuries after the palace fell, when its ruined halls lay half-buried and tangled with brush, the memory of that vast and winding house of the double axe might have darkened in the telling into a maze of dread, with a monster waiting at its heart. And the bull, everywhere at Knossos there are bulls. Their horns, carved in stone, crown the rooftops and the altars, great pairs of horns standing up against the sky, what scholars call horns of consecration. Bulls' heads of black stone, with gilded horns and eyes of rock crystal, were used to pour offerings. And on the painted walls, again and again, the bull comes charging, and young athletes meet him not with weapons, but with their own bodies. This is the bull leaping, the most famous and most mysterious of all the Minoan images. In the painting that survives best, a great dappled bull lunges forward, and one slender figure grasps his horns, and a second arches in a handstand over his very back, and a third stands behind with arms outstretched, having just come down. Whether such a thing could truly be done, whether a person could really vault the horns and back of a charging bull, scholars have long debated. Perhaps it was done with a tamed beast, or in some ritual fashion now lost, or perhaps the painters showed an ideal rather than a deed. But the bull plainly stood at the center of Minoan worship and ceremony, a creature of power and danger, honored and confronted and somehow made sacred, and out of that ancient reverence the Greeks, looking back, made their monster in the maze. The religion of the Minoans, so far as we can trace it, was not a thing of great temples and towering gods. They worshipped in the open air, on mountain peaks where shrines have been found heaped with little offerings, and in caves deep in the hills, and in small sacred rooms within the palace itself. They seem to have honored above all a goddess, or perhaps several, shown as a woman with arms upraised, or grasping serpents in each hand, or standing upon a mountain flanked by lions. Snakes and doves and the double axe and the sacred bull recur in their holy places. Theirs was a faith woven into the living world, into the peaks and the caves and the creatures of the island, gentle in its images though doubtless serious in its demands, and like so much else about them, only half visible to us now through the long dimness of the years. Now let us go down from the palace to the sea, for the Minoans were above all a people of the sea, and the sea was kind to them. Their ship, slender and painted, slipped out across the water carrying jars of olive oil and sweet wine. Fine cloth dyed the deep purple of crushed sea snails, pottery and worked bronze and delicate goods of every kind, and they came home riding low with copper from Cyprus and tin from far away, with ivory and ostrich eggs and gold from Egypt, with the raw stuffs of their crafts and stories from distant shores. You can almost feel the rhythm of their days, the morning bustle of the harbor, the creak of timber and the slap of water against the hulls, the salt drying on warm skin, the slow unloading of cargo under a sky already bright with heat. The Minoans traded with Egypt, where the painters of the pharaohs showed men they called the Keftiu bringing tribute, men in Minoan dress with the very vessels the Minoans made. They left their goods and their fashions and their painted styles on islands and shores all across the eastern Mediterranean, and far away at a place on the Egyptian delta, and in the cities of Canaan, the work of Minoan hands has been found. There were no great walls around their towns, no fortifications thrown up in fear, and few weapons of war among all their countless remains. This is one of the most striking things about them, for the sea itself was their wall, Their fleet held the waters around Crete, and the later Greeks remembered this and called it the thalassocracy, the rule of the sea, the first sea power of which the Greek world kept any memory. Behind the shield of their ships, the Minoans lived softly, building and trading and painting the world they loved upon their plastered walls, gathering wealth not by conquest but by commerce, by carrying the goods of the world from one shore to another and taking their profit on the way. And the life within that shelter was, by every sign, a good one. Imagine the ordinary days of the people of Knossos and the towns around it, the farmers in the valleys tending the three great crops of the Mediterranean, the grain and the olive and the vine, the same three that had fed the island for ages and would feed it for ages more. The herders on the slopes with their sheep, whose wool was spun and woven into the fine cloth the Minoans traded abroad. The potters and the smiths and the seal cutters at their patient work. The women in their bright flounced dresses, who appear in the frescoes with a prominence rare in the ancient world, taking part in the great ceremonies, seated in places of honor, perhaps holding rank and power we can no longer measure. There were games and processions and feasts in the great court. There was music, for harps and pipes and the sistrum appear in their art. It was a settled, prosperous, sunlit world, ordered and abundant, and it lasted in its calm and shining peace for several hundred years. But the long ages turn, as ages do, and the sea that had carried the islanders so far grew restless in its deep places. Some 90 miles to the north of Crete lay a small round island we now call Santorini, and the ancients called Thera. It was not an ordinary island. It was the cone of a sleeping volcano, and in the bright noon of Minoan power that volcano woke. There had been a thriving Minoan town upon Thera, a town we now call Akrotiri, with fine houses 2 and 3 stories high, with its own beautiful frescoes of boys boxing and ships sailing in procession and lilies blooming red against the rock. Warnings came first, earthquakes that cracked the walls so that the people gathered their valuables and fled, and when the great eruption came at last, it found the town empty. We have found no bodies there, only the houses, buried whole and preserved beneath the ash like a Bronze Age town held in amber. The eruption itself was one of the largest the world has known in all of human history. The mountain blew its heart into the sky in a column of ash and stone that darkened the day, and then the cone collapsed in upon the emptied chamber beneath it, and the sea rushed into the wound, and the island tore itself apart. The ash fell across the whole eastern Mediterranean. It has been found in the mud of the sea floor and in the ice of far-off Greenland and in the rings of ancient trees, and from those traces scholars still labor to fix the year, somewhere in the 16th or 17th century before our era. Great waves, born of the collapse, would have raced south toward Crete and fallen upon its northern harbors, the very harbors from which the Minoan ships put out. For a long time it was thought that this single catastrophe ended the Minoan world at a stroke. The truth, as the truth so often is, was slower and gentler and more complicated. The eruption was a grievous blow, and it surely shook the island in its trade and its confidence. But Knossos and the other centers lived on after it, for a century or more, rebuilt and still busy. What seems to have happened in the generations that followed is that the long peace of the Minoans was broken at last. Their fleet perhaps never fully recovered its old command of the sea, and from the rocky mainland to the north came a harder people, the Greek-speaking warriors we call the Mycenaeans, who had long admired the Minoans and learned from them, and who now grew strong while Crete grew weak. In time these mainlanders came to rule at Knossos itself. It is they who used the old Minoan script to write their early Greek, the linear B that Ventris would one day read, and the palace in its final phase, before it burned for the last time, was very likely a Mycenaean seat, a Greek lordship raised upon the bones of the older world. And so the great house at Knossos, after its long and shining life, fell quiet at last. It burned and was not rebuilt, and the painted halls emptied, the red columns lined and the bright plaster faded under drifting earth, and the people scattered to smaller villages among the olive trees, carrying their memories of the painted dance with them. It was not a single sudden ending, but a slow settling across many years, the way a warm day eases at last into dusk, the world simply growing older and turning its face toward what would come next. For the gifts of the island were not lost. They had drifted northward across the water long before the end, into the hands of the people on the mainland, who took up the love of fine things and the skill of the sea and the painted styles and the very arts of writing, and made them their own. The Mycenaeans who would build their citadels on the Greek mainland, the people of the age the poets would later sing of, learned much of what they knew from the Minoans of Crete. The painted dolphins, the slender ships, the cool, clever rooms full of light, the goddess with her upraised arms, all of these became seeds, carried on the wind toward a rockier shore. The Minoans were the first. Everything else in the long Greek story would grow, in part, from what they had begun upon their island. But there is no need to follow that story yet. For now, simply rest here a while on this warm hillside above Knossos, where the last light pools red against the painted columns and the sea goes dark and smooth as a held breath. The day is done. The ships are drawn up on the shore, the great jars stand full and quiet in their cool galleries, the painted dancers have gone to their rest, and the great house grows still around you, cool and safe and old beyond all reckoning. You do not need to remember any of it. You can let it settle and fade like the last light over distant hills. There is nothing to hold and nowhere to be, and no morning that will not come on its own. Let the warmth of the island settle into you, and the scent of time, and the murmur of the sea against the ancient shore. Rest now above Knossos, beneath the first stars of the oldest Greece. Sleep well. From the gentle island and its painted halls, let your mind drift north across the water now, slow as a sail upon a calm sea, until the land grows rockier beneath you and a wide plain opens out, ringed by pale dry mountains. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, no task that cannot keep until the morning. Let yourself settle, soft and unhurried, as a new city rises out of the haze before you, and at its heart, lifted high above the rooftops on a great shelf of gray stone, a hill crowned with marble, glowing in the evening light. This is Athens, and the high place is the Acropolis, and here we will rest a while. Tonight we will follow the long, slow story of this one city, from its humble beginnings to its golden height and the shadows that fell across it at the last. There is no need to hold the dates or the names in your mind. Let them pass over you like the murmur of water, and let yourself drift down, slowly and gently, towards sleep. Come down first into the city itself, into the low tangle of streets that spread out beneath the sacred hill. The houses are simple things of mud, brick, and timber, their flat roofs warm from the long day, their small courtyards open to the sky. In the cool of the evening, the lanes are full of slow movement, a water carrier returning from the spring, a potter wiping clay from his hands, children calling somewhere out of sight. The air smells of wood smoke and bread and the faint dust of the streets, and from a doorway comes the soft scrape of a lyre being tuned. It is an ordinary city of ordinary days, and yet from these narrow streets came ideas that would travel further than any ship. Athens was old long before it was great. The rock of the Acropolis had been a fortress and a refuge for as long as anyone could remember, a high place where people sheltered in time of danger, where springs of water rose within the stone, where the earliest kings of the place had kept their dwellings. In those distant days, before the time we are imagining, Athens was ruled by kings, as so many cities were, and then by noble families who held the best land and the oldest names. The common people farmed the thin soil of the plain, or fished the bright water of the Gulf, or worked the silver that lay in the hills to the south, and they had little say in how their city was run. It was a small place then, one among many in the rocky land the Greeks called Attica, and there was nothing yet to mark it out from its neighbors. But slowly over the generations, something began to change in Athens, and the change was this. The people began little by little to take their city into their own hands. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen smoothly. There were lawgivers who tried to ease the burdens of the poor and to set down rules that bound rich and poor alike. There were strongmen who seized power and ruled the city alone, and were in time cast out again. There were long quarrels between the great families and the common folk, and between one faction and another, of the kind that trouble every city of men. But out of all this struggle and striving, near the end of the 6th century before the Common Era, there arose a man named Cleisthenes, of one of the old noble houses, who gave Athens a new shape that would last. Cleisthenes did a quiet and remarkable thing. He took the people of Athens and the lands around it and reordered them, not by the old ties of family and clan that had divided them for so long, but into new groupings that mixed the city and the coast and the inland farms together, so that men who had been rivals now found themselves bound into common cause. He set up a great council to prepare the business of the city, its members chosen by lot from among the citizens, so that ordinary men, farmers and craftsmen and traders took their turn in the governing of the place. And above the council he set the assembly, the gathering of all the citizens, where the great matters were decided. For here in the open spaces of this city, the people had begun to do a curious and quiet thing. They had begun to govern themselves. They gathered, the citizens of the place, on a low hill in the open air, and there they spoke and listened and raised their hands, and by the counting of those raised hands they decided together how their city should be run. There were no kings now upon the high hill, no single voice that ruled them all. Instead there was the slow murmur of many voices, the long patient business of agreeing and disagreeing in the sunlight, and the word they had for this gentle, untidy, remarkable thing was a word that means simply the rule of the people. We say it still, all these centuries later. They called it democracy. From these unhurried gatherings beneath the open sky came a seed that would outlast every wall they built. It was not a perfect thing, this early rule of the people, and it is worth being honest about it, the way the Athenians themselves were not always honest about it. Only the men born of Athenian families could take part. The women of the city, who kept the households and raised the children and wove the cloth, had no voice in the assembly. The many who had come from other places to live and trade in Athens, however long they stayed, remained outsiders. And beneath them all labored the enslaved, who had no freedom at all, and on whose unfree work much of the city's leisure and wealth was built. The Athenians did not see these things as we see them. To them, the gathering of the citizens was a wide and generous thing, far wider than any their neighbors knew. And whatever its limits, it was a true beginning, the first time in the long story of the world that so many ordinary men sat down together to rule themselves, and it would be remembered long after the men who made it were dust. Now lift your eyes as the Athenians lifted theirs to the hill above. The path winds upward through a great gateway of columns, and as you climb the city falls away below and the sky opens wide in gold around you. And there at the summit it would one day stand, the temple they raised to the gray-eyed goddess who watched over the city and gave it her name. Her name was Athena, goddess of wisdom and of skill, and the city was her city, and her great temple upon the rock the Greeks called the Parthenon. But before we walk among its columns, we must speak of the storm that nearly swept the young city away, and out of which its golden age was born. For while Athens was learning to govern itself, far to the east a great empire had risen, the empire of the Persians, vaster than anything the Greeks had ever known, stretching from the rivers of the east to the shores of their own sea. And the Persian king turned his eyes westward, toward the small quarrelsome cities of the Greeks, and resolved to bring them under his hand. Twice the great armies came. The first time the Persians landed upon the plain of Marathon, not far from Athens, a wide stretch of level ground between the mountains and the sea. There the men of Athens, far fewer in number, came down against them, and against all expectation they held, and they drove the great army back into its ships. The runner who carried word of the victory back to the anxious city has never been forgotten. The plain of Marathon entered the memory of Athens forever, the day the citizens themselves, the farmers and the craftsmen, marched out and saved their city with their own hands. But the Persians came again 10 years later, and this time the king came in person, with a host so large that the old stories said it drank the rivers dry. The Athenians could not hold their city against such a multitude, and so they did a hard and brave thing. They left Athens. They put their wives and children and old folk aboard ships and carried them to safety on the islands and the far shore, and the men took to the warships, and the Persians came into the empty city and burned it. They burned the houses and the temples, they burned the old shrines upon the sacred rock, and the smoke of Athens rose into the sky. It must have seemed to those who watched from the decks of their ships that everything was ending. But then in the narrow waters by the island of Salamis, just off their own coast, the Greek ships fell upon the great Persian fleet in the crowded straits where its numbers could not help it, and there they shattered it. The tide of the war turned in those narrow waters, and within a year the invader was driven from the land for good. Athens had been burned to the ground, and Athens had been saved, both in the space of a single year. The city the Athenians came home to was ashes, but they were not a people to sit long in mourning. Out of the burning came the golden age, the brief and brilliant flowering for which Athens has been remembered ever since. For in the years after the war, Athens gathered around itself a great league of cities. The seafaring cities of the islands and the coasts banded together against the Persians should they ever come again. Each city paid into a common treasury, kept at first upon the sacred island of Delos, and so the league has been called the Delian League ever after. But Athens led it, Athens commanded its fleets, and over the years the league became less an alliance of equals and more an empire of Athens, the tribute of 100 cities flowing into the harbor of the one. and with that wealth and that confidence, Athens set about making itself the most beautiful city in the world. The man who guided the city through these golden years was named Pericles, and for a long generation his voice was the one the assembly heeded above all others. He was no king, and he held no crown. He was a citizen like the rest, who stood before the gathered people year after year and won them to his counsel by the force of his reason and the weight of his words, and they elected him again and again to lead their armies and shape their policy. It was Pericles who urged the Athenians to take the wealth of the lake and spend it not only on ships and walls, but on splendor, on temples and statues and works of beauty that would crown the city for the ages. There were Athenians who grumbled at the cost and at the using of the leg's money for the glory of one city. But Pericles had his way, and the result rose stone by stone upon the sacred rock above their heads. Now lift your eyes again to the summit where the marble is rising. The temple they raised to the goddess stands pale and gleaming against the deepening sky, its columns rising fluted and serene, swelling ever so slightly at their middles, leaning ever so slightly inward, shaped by builders who knew that a perfectly straight line looks bent to the human eye, and who curved their marble in secret so that it might appear to you flawlessly true. Nothing here is quite as simple as it seems. Every stone has been coaxed toward beauty. The men who raised it, the architects and the master masons, worked the white marble that was quarried from a mountain not far away and carried up the steep path to the rock, and they fitted the great blocks together so finely that no mortar was needed, stone resting upon stone with a precision that has held for thousands of years. Walk slowly among those columns now in the hush of the evening. The marble is still warm beneath your palm, holding the heat of the long day, and faintly where the light catches, you can see that it was once touched with color, soft reds and blues high among the carvings, where a long band of stone figures moves in an endless gentle procession, horses and riders and robed walkers, carved so finely they seem about to step down from the wall. They are the people of Athens themselves, carved in stone, walking in the great festival that honored their goddess, a river of marble figures moving forever around the temple. Within, in the cool dimness, stood once a great image of the goddess herself, tall and serene, gleaming with ivory and gold, her calm face turned forever toward the doorway in the light. The sculptor who made her was named Phidias, the greatest of his age, who oversaw all the carving of the temple, and men came from across the Greek world simply to stand before her in the dim and look up. Here the city kept its heart. And the temple did not stand alone upon the rock. The Athenians raised a great gateway of columns at the head of the climbing path, through which all who came to the sacred place must pass. They raised a smaller, more delicate temple, where slender maidens carved in stone stood in the place of columns, bearing the roof upon their patient heads. And somewhere among the buildings, the old stories said, grew the sacred olive tree that the goddess herself had given the city in the beginning, and near it a mark in the rock where the god of the sea had struck in the contest for the city's name. Athena had won that contest, the Athenians believed, by giving them the olive, the tree that gave them oil and food and light and shade, and so the city was hers, and the rock was hers, and the marble that crowned it was raised in her honor. And the city's heart was full. Down in the streets below, this was an age when the people seemed to wake all at once to the pleasures of thinking and making. Stonecutters and sculptors filled the workshops with the tap of bronze on marble. Painters covered walls with scenes of gods and heroes. Storytellers gathered crowds in the shade. Men argued cheerfully about the nature of the stars and the right way to live and the meaning of justice, and went home no wiser and perfectly content. Among them in those years walked a stonemason's son named Socrates, who would stop men in the street and ask them gentle, stubborn questions until they no longer felt so sure of what they thought they knew. He wrote nothing down and he asked for nothing, and yet the questions he asked in the open air of Athens would echo down the centuries long after the marble had weathered. He was only one of the many voices of that crowded, talking, restless city, but he was an Athenian to his bones, and the city that bred him would be remembered partly for his sake. Let us turn for a while from the great men and the great buildings to the quiet life of ordinary Athenians, for that too is a peaceful thing to imagine as you drift towards sleep. The Athenian house was a modest thing, turned inward, its rooms opening onto a small courtyard rather than a street, so that the noise and dust of the city were kept outside, and the life of the family was lived in the cool of the central yard. The men spent much of their day out of doors, in the open spaces of the city at their work or their talk or their public business. The women kept the household, and the heart of their domain was the loom, where the wool was spun and woven into cloth for the whole family, a slow and patient and never-ending work. Children played with knuckle bones and little clay toys, dogs dozed in the shade, and in the evening the family gathered for the simple meal, bread and olives and cheese and wine cut with water, the plain good food of a plain, hardworking people. They were not a rich people, most of them, for all the splendor on the hill above. They farmed the thin, dry soil of Attica, coaxing grain and olives and vines from a land that gave nothing easily, for the rains were brief and the summers long and dry, and a man learned to be patient with such a country. They sailed the bright water of the Gulf in their fishing boats and their trading ships, carrying the oil and the wine and the painted pottery of Athens out across the sea, the fine red and black vessels that artists had decorated with gods and heroes and the scenes of everyday life, and bringing back in their holds the grain that the home fields could never quite provide. And under the southern hills they dug the silver from the earth, the silver that paid for the warships and much of the city's wealth, work that was hard and dark and done largely by the enslaved, far from the marble and the sunlight. It was an ordinary city of ordinary days, and most of its people lived and died without ever speaking in the assembly or carving a line of marble, and yet they were the city, the many hands and many voices out of which all the rest was made. Their days were ruled by the slow turning of the seasons and the festivals that marked them, for the Athenians honored their gods through the whole of the year, and the greatest of their festivals was the one that honored Athena herself. Once each year, and with special splendor every fourth year, the whole city went up to the rock in a great procession, winding through the streets and up the climbing path, the young men on horseback and the maidens carrying offerings and the elders walking gravely behind, bearing a new robe woven for the goddess by the women of the city to drape upon her ancient image. It was this very procession that the carvers had set into the marble band high upon the temple, so that the people of Athens might walk forever in stone around the house of their goddess, and an Athenian standing below could look up and see his own city's great day carved into the heart of the white temple. There was something in that which the Athenians loved, this binding of the living city to the stone, the way a people might gather up their best and finest hours and lift them high above the rooftops to last beyond their own brief lives. There were quarrels, of course, between this city and others across the water, and ships went out and did not always return, and the people knew sorrow as all people do. For the golden age did not last, and the shadow that ended it grew out of the very greatness that Athens had won. The other great power among the Greeks, the stern land-bound city of the south, watched the rising empire of Athens with growing fear, and the smaller cities chafed under the heavy hand of Athenian rule, and at last the long-gathering storm broke into open war between the Greeks themselves. It was a long war and a terrible one, dragging on for a generation, and it wore Athens down by slow degrees. Worst of all, in its early years, a plague came into the crowded city, where the country folk had been packed behind the walls for safety, and it swept through the close streets and took a great part of the people, and among them in time it took Pericles himself, the man who had led them so long. The city went on without him, but it was never quite the same. The war ground on year after weary year, with victories that came to nothing and defeats that cut deep, until at the last the great fleet of Athens, the wooden walls that had saved her at Salamis, was destroyed in a far harbor across the sea, and the city stood undefended. Its enemies closed in, and its proud long walls were thrown down, and the empire it had built was lost. Athens did not die. It would live on for centuries yet, and its name and its ideas would outlast every kingdom around it. But the brief blazing height was over, and the city that had burned and risen and shone so brightly settled at last into a quieter age, carrying its memories and its marble into the long centuries to come. Yet the troubles, real as they were, passed over the city the way clouds pass over a hill, and the marble on the high place remained glowing, patient, sure. For all its arguing and building and striving and grieving, the city was learning to rest as you're learning to rest now. You might stand here long into the dusk on the warm stone of the Acropolis and watch the swallows wheel against the last of the light, and hear the city below grow slowly quiet as lamps are lit in 1,000 small windows. The mountains around the plain go violet, then gray, then merge softly with the night, and the great pale columns seem to gather what light remains and hold it, glowing faintly, long after the sun is gone. Marketplace empties, the lyre falls silent in its doorway. The raised hands of the assembly have all gone home to their suppers and their beds. The loom is quiet and the courtyard is dark, and the silver mines are still beneath the southern hills. and the goddess on her high hill keeps her quiet watch over the sleeping streets, asking nothing of anyone, only standing serene above the darkening plain, as she would stand for 2,500 years, long after the city that raised her had passed into memory. And so we let this part of the story rest. There is no need to remember any of it, not the lawgivers nor the great gatherings, not Marathon nor Salamis, not the White Temple nor the men who raised it. Let it fade like the last light over distant hills, and let your breath grow slow and even. You are warm and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do tonight. The marble city sleeps beneath its stars, and you may sleep too. Sleep well. Leave the marble city now, sleeping under its lamps, and let your mind drift south, over the dry, pale mountains, down into a long green valley, where a swift, cold river runs between groves of poplar and plane. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, no task that cannot keep until the morning. Let the road unwind slowly beneath you, mile after gentle mile, until the mountains close in on either side, and you come at last into the valley of Sparta, hidden away from the sea, quiet and green and far from the noise of the world. This is the story of Sparta, the strange and stern city of the Greeks, in the long valley of Laconia, in the years when it was the strongest land of spears in all the Greek world. It is a strange and simple place, and you feel it the moment you arrive. There is no high hill crowned with gleaming temples here, no maze of marble columns, no great gateway to climb. The Spartans did not care to build such things. Their town is a loose scatter of villages along the riverbank, low and plain, and a visitor from the marble city might walk through the whole of it and wonder where the city was. For these people poured their pride not into stone but into themselves, and a Spartan would tell you, with a small, dry smile, that the bravery of its people was the only wall a city ever truly needed. The valley around them is rich and good, watered by the cold river that comes down from the mountains, heavy with snow even in the warm months. They called that river the Eurotas, and along its banks the olive trees silver the lower slopes, barley ripens golden in the flat fields, and figs and grapes hang sweet in the long afternoons. Rising to the west, vast and pale, stands the great range they called Taygetos, its high peaks white even in summer, catching the last gold of the evening long after the valley below has gone to shadow. The Spartans lived always in the shadow of that mountain, and something of its plainness and its strength seemed to have settled into them. Let us speak first of how they governed themselves, for in this, as in so much else, they did not resemble their neighbors at all. Most cities of the Greeks were ruled by one king, or by a council of the wealthy, or in the marble city to the north, by the gathered voice of the people. But Sparta was ruled strangely by two kings at once, two royal houses descended from two ancient brothers, reigning side by side through all the long centuries. The two kings sat together, led the armies together, offered the sacrifices together, and watched one another with the wary respect of partners who could never be fully alone in their power. It was an old arrangement, older than memory, and the Spartans never saw fit to change it. They believed that two kings would check each other, that neither could grow into a tyrant while the other lived, and so they kept their double crown long after other peoples had cast their kings aside. But the kings, for all their honor, did not rule alone, and they did not rule without restraint. Beside them stood a council of elders, which the Spartans called the Gerousia, made up of the two kings and 28 old men, each of them past his 60th year, each chosen for life. To sit among these elders, a man had to have lived a long life of service and proved his worth 100 times, and once chosen he sat until he died. They were the gray and weighty heart of the city, the keepers of its laws and customs, the ones who deliberated slowly over war and peace and brought their decisions before the people. And the people themselves, the gathered body of Spartan men, would meet to vote, not by counting raised hands, but by shouting, the louder cry carrying the day, a rough and ancient way of deciding that suited a people who trusted the voice more than the pen. And over all of this, watching even the kings, stood 5 magistrates chosen fresh each year, whom the Spartans called the ephors. These 5 were the guardians of the city's discipline, the watchmen of its laws and its morals, and their power was very great. They could call the kings to account, could even put them on trial, could oversee the upbringing of the young and the conduct of the old, could send the army out and call it home. Each year 5 new men took up the office, and so no single man could hold that power for long. It was a careful balance, this Spartan constitution, kings and elders and magistrates in the shouting assembly, each holding the others in check, and the Spartans were quietly proud of it, believing it had given them a steadiness that other cities, forever lurching between tyranny and chaos, could only envy. The Spartans said that all of this had been given to them by a single lawgiver, a man named Lycurgus, who lived so far back in the mists of their past that no one could say with certainty when, or even whether he had truly lived at all. The story told that Lycurgus, troubled by the disorder of his city, traveled to the oracle and to distant lands, gathering wisdom, and returned to give Sparta its laws, its discipline, its whole way of living. And when his work was done, the story said, he made the Spartans swear a great oath to keep his laws unchanged until he returned, and then he went away and never came back, so that they were bound by their oath forever. Whether one man truly shaped all this, or whether it grew slowly over many lifetimes as such things usually do, the Spartans believed it was the gift of Lycurgus, and they held to his laws with a stubbornness that few peoples have ever matched. And the heart of those laws, the thing that made Sparta unlike any other place, was the upbringing of its children, the long, hard schooling they called the agora. Among other Greeks, a boy was raised in his father's house, taught his letters and his manners by his family, and grew up more or less as his parents saw fit. But in Sparta, the son of a citizen belonged less to his family than to the city. At the age of 7, he was taken from his mother's house and gathered with the other boys into companies, to be raised together, to eat together, to sleep together on beds of reeds they cut for themselves from the riverbank, to learn together the hard arts of endurance. It was a stern schooling by any measure. The boys were given little food and were expected to make up the lack by their own cleverness, even by stealing, though they were punished if they were caught, not for the theft itself, but for the clumsiness of being discovered. They were given a single cloak to wear through summer and winter alike, so that they might learn to bear heat and cold without complaint. They went barefoot, that their feet might grow hard. They were taught to obey instantly and completely, to speak only when spoken to, and to answer briefly and to the point. They learned to run and wrestle and throw, to handle the spear and the shield, to march in step and hold their place in the line. And above all, they learned to endure pain and hardship without a sound, for the Spartan held that complaint was the beginning of weakness, and weakness the beginning of defeat. It was a hard life by any reckoning, and yet there was a strange peace in it too, the peace of people who have decided long ago exactly what they value and who waste no breath on the rest. A Spartan was famous for saying much in few words, and the very name of their valley, Laconia, has given us a word for plain speech ever since, the word laconic, which means to say a great deal with very little. They prized the short answer, the dry remark, the truth spoken plainly and then let go. When a great conqueror once sent them a threat, warning that if he entered their land he would raze their city to the ground, the Spartans are said to have sent back a single word in reply, the word if, and nothing more. That was the Spartan way, to bend nothing, to waste nothing, not even words. Walk among them in the cool of the evening, and you find a people unlike any other in this rocky land. The young run and wrestle in the dust of the riverside fields, and among them, remarkably, the girls run too, swift and strong, for here the people believed that strong mothers made a strong people. This was perhaps the strangest thing of all to the other Greeks, who kept their women indoors and quiet and out of sight. The women of Sparta were raised almost as the boys were, taught to run and to throw, to exercise their bodies in the open air, to grow strong and healthy and unafraid. They were not sent to spin and weave in shadowed rooms, for that work was given to others, and a Spartan woman moved through the world with a freedom and a boldness that astonished visitors. She owned property and managed estates and spoke her mind plainly, and when the men were away at war, which was often, she ran the affairs of the household and the land. The women of Sparta were famous for their sharp tongues and their fierce pride, and the saying went that a Spartan mother, handing her son his shield as he marched to war, would tell him to come back with it or upon it, carried home dead upon his shield rather than throwing it away in flight. Whether or not such words were truly spoken, they tell us much about how the Spartans wished to see themselves. But beneath all this hardness and this pride there lay a deeper thing, and it is a darker thing, and we must speak of it gently as we speak of everything here, the way the valley itself lets the seasons pass. For the Spartans could live their stern and simple lives, could spend their days in training and their evenings at the common table, could give themselves wholly to the arts of war and never trouble themselves with trade or farming, only because the actual labor of their land was done by others. These others were a vast population of unfree people whom the Spartans called the Helots, the men and women of the conquered lands, bound to the soil, working the fields and the olive groves and the flocks, and giving over a portion of all they produced to the Spartan masters who owned the land. The Helots far outnumbered their masters many times over, and the Spartans never forgot it and never ceased to fear it. Much of the strange harshness of the Spartan way of life, the endless training, the readiness for war, the iron discipline was rooted in this quiet fear, the fear of the multitude that worked beneath them and might one day rise. It was not a gentle arrangement, and the Spartans did hard and cruel things to keep their helots in their place, and there is no softening it. Yet it was upon this foundation that the whole of Spartan life was built. Freed from all common labor, the Spartan citizen could devote his entire life to the city and to war, could become a soldier and nothing but a soldier, in a way that no farmer or merchant ever could. The strength of Sparta and the bondage of the helots were two sides of a single coin, and one could not have existed without the other. So the Spartan citizen, his food grown by other hands, gave his whole life to the city. And the shape of that life, for a grown man, centered on the common table, the shared mess they called the syssischa. Every Spartan man belonged to one of these messes, a small company of 15 or so, and there he took his meals each day, all the days of his life, sharing the same plain food with the same companions, the great and the humble alike sitting down to the same fare. They ate simple food at these long shared tables, and the most famous dish among them was a dark broth, a thick black soup that other Greeks found nearly inedible. A wealthy visitor who once tasted that plain dark broth is said to have remarked dryly that now he understood why the Spartans did not fear death, for to a man fed on such fare, death could hold little terror. Each man contributed his share to the common table from the produce of his land, a measure of barley, of wine, of cheese, of figs. And if a man fell so poor that he could no longer pay his share, he could no longer sit at the table, and a Spartan who could not sit at the table was scarcely a full Spartan at all. So the messes bound the men together, knit them into companies that ate together and would one day fight together, and taught them from youth to old age that they belonged not to themselves but to one another. There was laughter at these tables, but it was brief, and there was song, but it was grave and deep, sung in low choruses as the sun went down behind the white mountain. The old men sat and watched and said little, and what they said was weighed and short. For the truth of Sparta, beneath its hardness, was a kind of stillness. Theirs was a world stripped of clutter and noise, of ornament and excess, a world reduced to a few clear things, the river, the mountain, the field, the table, the loyalty of one to another. They did not chase the dazzling, many-voiced restlessness of the marble city. They did not prize gold or fine clothes or painted houses, and for a long age they would not even use coins of silver and gold like other peoples, keeping instead heavy bars of iron so cumbersome and so worthless that no man could grow rich by hoarding them, nor easily be bribed. They asked of life only enough and bore the rest, and slept, one imagines, the deep untroubled sleep of people who carry no surplus weight of wanting. In all of this, the schooling and the messes and the iron discipline bent toward a single end, which was war, and toward a single instrument of war that the Spartans perfected above all others, the line of shields they called the phalanx. The Spartans were known above all as people of the spear, and when the cities of the land fell to disputing, their grave columns of bronze-clad men would file out through the mountain passes, shields locked, moving in a slow and dreadful unison. Each man carried a great round shield upon his left arm, and that shield covered not only himself but the man to his left, so that the whole line stood or fell together, every soldier depending upon his neighbor, every neighbor depending upon him. They wore crimson cloaks, the color of which would not show the blood, and they grew their hair long and dressed it with care before battle, calm and unhurried, as men who had trained for this their whole lives and had nothing left to fear. Other Greeks fought in the phalanx too, for it was the way of that age, but none did it so well as the Spartans, who alone among the Greeks were soldiers by profession, drilled from childhood, fearless and tireless and terrible in the line. Let us tell, softly and without alarm, the most famous thing the Spartans ever did, which happened at a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, in a place called Thermopylae. In that age a vast empire lay to the east, the empire of the Persians, and its great king led an army westward into Greece, an army so large that the Greeks said it drank the rivers dry. The scattered cities of the Greeks, so often at odds with one another, gathered what forces they could to bar the way, and it fell to one of the two Spartan kings, a man named Leonidas, to hold the narrow pass with a small band of men, 300 Spartans of his own and some thousands of allies, while the rest of Greece prepared. The number 300 has echoed down the ages ever since, for those were the full Spartan citizens who stood with their king in that narrow place. For days the small force held the pass, where the mountains pressed so close upon the sea that the great host of the Persians could not bring its numbers to bear, and wave after wave of the king's men broke upon the locked shields of the Greeks and fell back. It is told that when a man came to Leonidas in fear, saying that the Persian arrows were so many they would darken the sun, a Spartan answered calmly that this was good news, for then they would fight in the shade. That was the laconic way, even at the end. At last a path over the mountains was betrayed to the Persians, and the great army came around behind the pass, and Leonidas understood that the place could not be held. He sent most of the allies away to live and fight another day, and he stayed with his 300 Spartans and a few who would not leave, and they died there in the pass, every one of them fighting until the spears were broken, and then with swords, and then with hands and teeth, so the story tells, holding the line to the very last. It was a defeat in the plainest reckoning, for the pass was lost and the Persians marched on. And yet the Spartans counted it among their greatest glories, for the 300 had done exactly what a Spartan was raised to do, had stood their ground and obeyed their orders and died without flinching and without flight, and in dying they had bought time for the rest of Greece, and they had shown the great king what manner of men he had come to conquer. Long after, a simple stone was set up in the pass, bearing words that asked the passing traveler to carry word back to Sparta that here her sons lay, obedient to her laws, having done as they were bid. There was no boasting in it, no cry of triumph, only the plain fact told the Spartan way of duty kept to the end. In the years that followed, the Greeks turned back the Persians at last, and for a time Sparta stood among the foremost cities of Greece, the unquestioned masters of war on land, even as the marble city to the north grew great upon the sea. But two such powers could not long share the same world in peace, and at length a long and bitter war broke out between them, a war that dragged on for nearly 30 years and drew in nearly every city of the Greeks on one side or the other. The Spartans, patient and stubborn as ever, endured the long struggle, and in the end, with their armies on land and a fleet built at last with foreign gold, they prevailed, and the marble city's long dominion was broken, and Sparta stood for a brief season as the leading power of all Greece. But it was a brief season, and it did not last, and there is a quiet lesson in how it passed. For the very qualities that made Sparta strong in war made it ill-suited to rule. The Spartans knew how to fight and to endure and to obey, but they did not know how to govern others gently, and the cities they had freed from the marble city soon found Spartan rule no kinder, and there was a deeper weakness still, a slow and silent one. The full citizens of Sparta, the true Spartans who sat at the messes and stood in the phalanx, had always been few, and over the long years of war and hardship they grew fewer and fewer, until at last there were too few left to fill the ranks. A rival city to the north, long held down, rose against them, and on a field called Leuctra the unbeaten Spartan phalanx was broken at last by a clever enemy, and the spell of Spartan invincibility, which had held for so many generations, was broken with it. The helots of the western lands were freed, the great estates that had fed the messes were lost, and Sparta, though it lingered on for centuries more, never again was what it had been. The valley grew quiet, and the spears were laid down, and in time the stern city of Lycurgus became a kind of legend even to the Greeks themselves, a place men visited to wonder at the strange, hard customs of a vanished age. Even this we may let pass softly, the way the valley itself lets the seasons pass, for the spear, when it was set aside at last, was set aside for good, and the men, those who remained, came home to the fields and the river and the long shared tables, and took up again the small, plain business of their days. The mountain still stood white above the valley, and the cold river still ran down over its stones, indifferent to the rise and fall of cities, as rivers always are. So let the valley grow quiet around you now, as the great white mountain catches the last of the light and the cold river runs on, murmuring over its stones in the dark. The long tables are cleared, the grave songs have ended, the children sleep, tired and content, in the simple houses along the bank. The Spartans wanted little, and in wanting little, perhaps, they found it easier than most to lay their burdens down at the end of the day, and you may lay yours down too, here in the shadow of the mountain, with nothing left to hold. And so we let this part of the story rest. There is no need to remember any of it. Let it fade like the last light over distant hills, and let your breath grow slow and even. You are warm and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do tonight. Sleep well. From the quiet valley of the Spartans, where strength was a kind of stillness, let your mind drift now toward another green and sheltered place, not far away across the rolling country of the south, a sacred grove beside a slow river, where the cities of the land laid down their quarrels and met instead to run. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, no task that cannot keep until the morning. You can let the words settle over you like the warm dust of a summer evening, and let yourself be carried gently into the valley of Olympia, where the air is sweet with crushed grass and wild olive, and the whole land has come together in peace. Olympia lies in the western part of the great peninsula the Greeks called the Peloponnese, in a low and fertile country where two rivers meet, the broad Alpheos and the smaller Cladios that joins it from the north. It is not a city, and it never was one. There were no walls here, no marketplace, no crowded streets of houses. There was only the sanctuary, a wide and sacred enclosure set among the trees, where for more than 1,000 years the Greeks came to honor their greatest god and to hold the most famous of all their festivals. The valley is green and shaded, watered by the rivers, sheltered by a low wooded hill they called the Hill of Knossos, and over it all there lay, in the season of the games, a deep and unhurried calm that came from the knowledge that this was holy ground. For the games at Olympia were, before they were anything else, an act of worship. We are apt to think of them now as a contest of athletes, a meeting of runners and wrestlers, but to the Greeks who first gathered here they were a festival in honor of Zeus, the father of the gods, the lord of the sky and the thunder, whose great temple stood at the heart of the sanctuary. The running and the wrestling were offerings to him, as the smoke of the sacrifices was an offering, as the hymns and the processions were offerings. Men brought him the finest thing they had, which was the strength and the skill of their own bodies, and they laid it before him in the form of a contest, and the victory of the strongest was understood as a thing pleasing to the god. To win at Olympia was to be, for a little while, beloved of Zeus. How the festival began no one could say for certain, and the Greeks, who loved a good origin, told several stories about it. Some said that Heracles himself, the strongest of all heroes, the son of Zeus, had founded the games long ago, pacing out the length of the running track with his own feet and planting the wild olive trees whose leaves would crown the victors. Others told of Pelops, the hero for whom the whole peninsula was named, who was said to have won a great and terrible chariot race against a cruel king to gain his bride, and to have established the games in memory of his victory. These were old tales, half remembered and half invented, reaching back into a time before any clear record, and the Greeks did not trouble themselves overmuch to choose between them. What mattered was that the games were ancient, rooted in the age of heroes, blessed from the beginning by gods and demigods. But the Greeks also kept a date, a real one, a year from which they began to count. In a year we would call 776 before the Common Era, the records of Olympia begin with the name of the first recorded victor, a cook from the nearby town of Elis named Koroibos, who won the foot race. From that year onward the Greeks reckoned time itself by the games. They counted in spans of 4 years, the interval between one festival and the next, and each such span they called an Olympiad, and they would speak of a thing happening in the 3rd year of such and such an Olympiad, naming it by the victor of that distant summer. It is a gentle thought that a whole civilization should have measured the passing of its years, not by the reigns of kings or the wars of cities, but by the recurring of a peaceful festival in a green valley, marked out by the names of men who had run swiftly or wrestled well. And because the festival belonged to all the Greeks and not to any single city, something remarkable grew up around it, a thing the Greeks called the ekacheria, the holding of hands, which we may call the sacred truce. The Greeks were a quarrelsome people, divided into many cities that warred with one another constantly, and the roads between them were often dangerous. So it was decreed under the protection of Zeus that for the period of the festival all war must cease. Heralds went out from Olympia in every direction, crowned with olive, proclaiming the truce, and from the moment they spoke it, no army might march through the sacred land, no weapon might be carried into the sanctuary, no city might make war upon the festival or upon those traveling to it. The truce did not end the wars of Greece. The armies merely waited and took up their quarrels again when the games were done. But for those weeks the spears were set down and the roads were safe, and a man from any city, however bitter its enmities, might travel unharmed to Olympia and home again. For a few bright days the rivers ran with no blood but the river's own, and the only victories were the small clean ones of foot and arm. Picture the valley then in the high summer of a festival year, when the appointed season has come round at last. The people pour in from every corner of the Greek world, from the marble cities of the mainland, from the islands scattered across the wine-dark sea, from the distant colonies along far-off shores, from the coasts of Asia and the fields of Sicily and the edges of the known world. They come on foot and by ship and by cart, raising a haze of golden dust on every road, until the whole valley is full. It becomes, for these few days, a city of tents and color where no city stood before. Merchants spread their wares in the shade of the plane trees. Poets recite to anyone who will pause and listen. Sellers of food and wine and trinkets cry their goods. Old friends from distant cities embrace, having traveled half a lifetime's roads to meet again. The air is thick with wood smoke and roasting meat, with the smell of oil and dust and trampled herbs, with the hum of tens of thousands of voices speaking 100 dialects of one shared tongue. By night, the cooking fires glimmer all across the valley floor like fallen stars, and the talk and the singing drift up into the warm dark long after the sun has gone. At the center of it all stood the sanctuary itself, the sacred enclosure the Greeks called the Altes, a walled grove crowded with temples and altars and treasuries and statues, dense with the offerings of 1,000 years. Here grew the wild olive, the sacred tree from which the victors' crowns were cut. Here stood the great ash altar of Zeus, built up over the centuries from the ashes of countless sacrifices until it rose like a small hill of its own. And here in time the Greeks raised to their god the grandest temple in the whole peninsula, a vast building of pale local stone, ringed about with mighty columns, its gables carved with the figures of heroes and the deeds of the gods. Within it, seated upon a throne of cedar and gold and ivory, sat the image of Zeus himself. This statue was the wonder of Olympia and one of the wonders of the whole ancient world. It was the work of the sculptor Pheidias, the same master who had adorned the great city of the violet crown, and he made it of gold and ivory laid over a frame of wood, a colossal seated figure so large that men said, had the god risen from his throne, he would have lifted the roof from the temple. The flesh was of ivory, pale and smooth. The robe and the ornaments were of beaten gold. In one hand the god held a figure of victory, and in the other a scepter upon which an eagle perched. His face was grave and kind at once, and so serene, the Greeks said, that those who came before it fell silent, feeling themselves very small and the world very kind. Pilgrims came from across the earth simply to stand in the cool, dim temple and gaze up at the calm gold face of the father of the gods. For more than 800 years that great image sat in its place, while empires rose and fell around it, and only in the very last age of the ancient world was it lost. But let us go out from the temple now into the sunlight to the contests themselves, for these were the reason the people had come. The oldest and the simplest of all the events was the foot race, which the Greeks called the stadion, run the length of the running track, a straight course of packed earth a little under 200 paces long. For the first many festivals, this single race was the whole of the games, and the man who won it gave his name to the entire Olympiad. Picture the runners gathering at the start, their bodies bare and gleaming with oil, their faces calm and grave. They take their places at a row of stone sills set into the track, where grooves cut in the stone gave their toes a purchase. A hush falls over the gathered crowd. The only sound is the murmur of the river and the rustle of leaves. Then the signal, and they are away, a sudden thunder of feet on packed earth, the dust rising gold behind them, the whole valley calling out as one. The race is short and the runners few, and in moments it is done, and one of them stands breathing hard in the sunlight, and the crowd calls his name and the name of his city, and that name, they believe, will be remembered for all the ages of the world. In time, other races were added as the festival grew and the days of it lengthened. There was a race of double the length, down the track and back again, and a long-distance race of many laps that tested the endurance rather than the speed of the body. And there was a strange and stirring race run by men in armor, carrying the heavy bronze shield and wearing the helmet of the warrior, so that the dust rose in a great cloud and the bronze flashed in the sun. A contest that reminded the Greeks that the swiftness of the runner had once been and might again be the swiftness of the soldier. But even as the program grew, the simple foot race down the track kept its place of honor, the oldest of all the events, the heart of the games. Then there was the pentathlon, the contest of 5 events, which the Greeks admired above many others because it asked not for a single narrow gift, but for the all-round excellence of a complete athlete. The 5 were the foot race, the long jump, the throwing of the discus, the throwing of the javelin, and wrestling. The jumper swung weights of stone or bronze in his hands as he leapt, drawing them forward to lend himself flight and then casting them back, so that the weights seemed almost to lift him through the air. A flute player often marked the rhythm of his approach. The discus, a flat, heavy disc of stone or bronze, was swung and released to sail across the field, and the Greeks thought the body of the thrower, poised at the moment of the throw, so beautiful that they carved it in marble and remembered it forever. The javelin was cast for distance, helped on its way by a leather thong wound about the shaft. And the whole long afternoon of the pentathlon unfolded slowly, a event by event, in the warm light, until the matter was decided, and one man stood first among the five. After the contests of running and throwing came the contests of strength, the heavy events in which men matched their bodies directly against one another. There was wrestling, in which each man strove to throw the other to the ground, and the bout was won by the first to score 3 falls. It was a contest of skill and balance and patient strength, of grips and holds and sudden turns, fought in the soft dust of the wrestling ground. There was boxing, harder and more punishing, in which the fighters bound their hands and forearms with long strips of leather and struck at one another until one could fight no more or raised his hand in surrender. There were no rounds and no rest, and a single bout might last until the heat of the day had passed. And there was the pancration, the hardest of all, a contest that joined wrestling and boxing together with few rules to soften it, in which a man might strike or grip or throw or hold his opponent down, and which ended only when one of the two gave in or could no longer continue. These were severe contests, and the Greeks did not pretend otherwise, but even these they watched with a kind of grave attention rather than a fever, for they were offerings to the god as much as any race, and the strong man who endured was honored as one whom Zeus had favored. And then there were the contests of horses, held not on the track but in a broad open field beside it, the hippodrome, where the ground was wide enough for many teams to run together. Here came the 4-horse chariots, wheeling in a thunder of hooves and a banner of dust around the long course, turning at the posts at either end where the danger was greatest and chariots might crash and tangle and overturn. Here too were the races of single horses ridden by small light riders, and races of mule carts, and other contests besides that came and went over the centuries. The horse races were the events of the rich, for only a wealthy man could keep and train and bring to Olympia a team of fine horses, and the prize for the chariot race went not to the driver who held the reins but to the owner of the team, so that even women, who were otherwise barred from the contests, might win an Olympic crown by entering their horses. The thunder of the chariots and the great cloud of dust they raised, and the cheering of the crowd as the teams swept round the turning posts, were among the grandest sights of the festival, and the most dangerous and the most magnificent. Behind all these contests lay long years of labor, for the athletes did not come to Olympia untrained. A man who wished to compete had to swear that he had trained for 10 months, and in the last weeks before the festival, the competitors gathered at the nearby town of Elis, which administered the games, and trained there together under the eyes of the judges, in the wrestling schools and on the practice tracks, eating the plain heavy diet the trainers prescribed, anointing themselves with oil and scraping it away again with the curved bronze tool they used to clean the dust from their skin. The training was hard and the discipline severe, and the judges watched not only the bodies of the men but their conduct. For an athlete who broke the rules, who struck a foul blow or bribed an opponent, was fined, and from the fines were cast bronze statues of Zeus that stood in a row along the way into the stadium, each one a silent reproach, a reminder to every athlete who passed them of what was owed to the god and to honest contest. For the prize itself, when all the labor was done and the victory won, was not gold. The winner received only a simple wreath, cut from the sacred wild olive tree that grew beside the great temple, twined into a crown by a boy whose parents were both still living, and set upon his brow. That was all. And yet there was no honor in all the land more dearly bought or more deeply prized, for to carry that plain green crown home to one's city was to carry glory itself. The victor's name was proclaimed aloud, with the name of his father and his city, before the whole gathered Greek world. He might have his statue set up in the sacred grove. The poets would compose great odes in his honor, songs that praised not only the man but his family and his city and the gods who had favored him. And when at last he came home, his city would often break down a piece of its own wall to let him enter, as if to say that a city which had produced such a man had no need of walls to defend it. Some cities granted their Olympic victors free meals for the rest of their lives, or seats of honor at every public gathering. The Greeks understood, it seems, that the things most worth winning cannot be bought, only earned in the doing, and so they gave for the greatest prize the humblest of objects, a crown of leaves, and let the honor of it do the rest. Olympia was the oldest and the greatest of these gatherings, but it was not the only one. The Greeks held 4 great festivals of contests, spread across the years so that scarcely a season passed without one, and a true champion might seek to win at all of them. At Delphi, beneath the slopes where the god Apollo was worshipped, were held the Pythian Games, which added to the athletic contests great competitions of music and song, fitting for the god of the lyre. On the narrow neck of land that joined the southern peninsula to the rest of Greece were held the Isthmian Games in honor of the Lord of the Sea. And in another quiet valley were held the Nemean Games, sacred again to Zeus. Each had its own crown of leaves, laurel, pine, wild celery, and a man who won it all four in his turn was honored above almost any other, a champion of the whole Greek world. Together these festivals wove a kind of calendar of peace across the quarrelsome land, drawing its scattered and rival cities together again and again, reminding them that for all their wars and their differences of speech and custom, they were one people, who worshipped the same gods and spoke the same tongue and gathered, when the appointed seasons came, to run beneath the same trees. And so the days of the festival would unfold, gentle and grand at once, the wrestlers in the dust, the leapers with their weights swinging to lend them flight, the chariots wheeling in their thunder around the long field, the boxers and the throwers and the runners in armor, and over it all the great altar smoking with the offerings to Zeus, the 100 oxen given to the god on the central day of the festival, the long procession of priests and envoys and victors winding through the sacred grove. Between the contests there was feasting and song and the slow renewing of old friendships, and within the grandest of the temples, the great gold image of the Sky Father sat serene among the shadows, gazing out over the festival held in his honor. For a few days a land so often divided, so quick to quarrel and to march, set all of that aside, as it had done again and again across the long turning of the years, and came together simply to run beneath the trees and crown one another with leaves, and the only kings were boys with olive in their hair. For nearly 12 centuries the festival kept its season. Long after the cities of Greece had lost their freedom, long after they had passed under the rule of foreign kings and then under the rule of distant Rome, still the games went on in the green valley by the river, and still the crowds gathered, and still the olive was cut and the crowns were twined. The Romans, when they came to rule the Greek world, did not at first disturb the games, and some of their emperors honored Olympia and even competed there, though the old purity of the festival faded slowly as the centuries passed, and at times the sanctuary was plundered of its treasures, and its statues were carried away to adorn distant cities. The great gold and ivory Zeus was at last taken from his temple and borne off to the city of Constantine on the Bosphorus, where in a later age he perished in a fire. And in the end, when the old gods were no longer worshipped across the world and a new faith had spread through the empire, the festival in honor of Zeus had no longer any place, and by decree of a Roman emperor near the close of the 4th century of the Common Era, the games were brought to an end, after more than 1100 years. The crowds stopped coming, the temples fell silent. In the centuries that followed, earthquakes shook down the great columns, and the two rivers, flooding season after season, buried the whole sanctuary deep in mud and sand, until the green valley returned to grass and silence, and the place where the Greeks had gathered for 1,000 summers lay forgotten under the fields, waiting in the dark for a far later age to find it again. Let the festival quiet now as the last evening of it comes. The crowds have thinned, the tents are coming down, the river runs on, slow and untroubled beneath the darkening plane trees. Somewhere a single runner walks alone in the gathering dusk, the olive wreath still cool upon his brow, and the great temple gathers the last of the light and holds it pale among the leaves. The contests are over. There is nothing left to win and nothing left to prove, and the whole green valley settles softly toward its rest. And as the grove falls silent, our journey will drift next from the running of bodies to the running of thought, to the shaded walks and quiet gardens, where a different kind of Greek went seeking not a crown of leaves, but the answers to the oldest and gentlest of questions. But there is no need to wonder yet. For now, simply rest here beneath the plane trees by the slow and murmuring river. And so we let this part of the story rest. There is no need to remember any of it. Let it fade like the last light over distant hills, and let your breath grow slow and even. You are warm and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do tonight. Sleep well. From the running of bodies in the green grove, let your mind drift now toward the running of thought, back to the streets and shaded gardens of the Marble City, where a different sort of contest was always quietly underway, not of foot and arm, but of question and answer, carried on in the cool of the evening among friends. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, no task that cannot keep until the morning. Let yourself settle into the soft lamplit hours when the work of the day is done, and the people of the Greek world turn, as they love to do, to wondering aloud about the world. It did not begin in the Marble City, though, but far away, across the wine-dark sea, on the eastern edge of the Greek world, in the prosperous trading towns that line the coast of what is now Turkey. There, some 6 centuries before the Common Era, in a city called Miletus, a man named Thales looked up at the world and asked a question so simple that no one before him seems to have thought to ask it plainly. He asked what everything was made of. Not what the gods had decreed, not what the old stories told, but what beneath all the change and variety of things lay at the bottom of it all, one single stuff out of which the many things of the world were somehow fashioned. Thales answered that it was water. That water, which can be solid as ice and soft as rain and thin as rising mist, was the root of everything. We need not decide tonight whether he was right. What mattered was the asking, for in that question, gentle and bare, something new came quietly into the world, the habit of explaining nature by nature itself and not by the will of gods. Thales had a pupil, or at least a younger countryman, named Anaximander, who carried the thought a step further into the dark. He was not content to say that everything came from water, or from any one of the familiar things we can see and touch, for each of those, he reasoned, was already too particular, too much itself. Instead, he spoke of something he called the boundless, a vast, formless, ageless stuff with no edges and no qualities of its own, out of which all the definite things of the world emerge, and back into which they pass away again in their season. He drew, it is said, one of the first maps of the known world, and he imagined the earth not resting on water or on any support, but hanging unsupported at the center of all things, held in place because there was no reason for it to fall one way rather than another. It is a strange and beautiful idea to hold in the mind as you grow drowsy, the round earth floating freely in the midst of the boundless, needing nothing to hold it up. Far to the west, on the island of Samos and later in the Greek towns of southern Italy, there gathered around a man named Pythagoras a community of a wholly different kind, half school, half brotherhood, bound by quiet rules and shared silences. The Pythagoreans came to believe that the secret of the world was not water or air or any substance at all, but number. They had noticed something that delighted and astonished them, that the notes of music, the very harmonies that pleased the ear, answer to simple whole number ratios in the length of a plucked string, that beauty itself could be counted, and that the cosmos might be, at its heart, a kind of music written in numbers. They studied the triangles and the stars, and they believed the soul did not die with the body but passed in time into another life. Much of what they thought they kept secret, and much is lost, but the idea they planted, that beneath the surface of things lies a hidden order that can be grasped by the patient mind, would never afterward leave the Western imagination. Back along the eastern coast, in the city of Ephesus, there lived a solitary and difficult thinker named Heraclitus, who looked at the world and saw not stillness but ceaseless motion. Everything flows, he said, everything is always becoming something else. You cannot step into the same river twice, he taught, for the waters that touched you a moment ago have already moved on toward the sea, and other waters have come, and the river, though it keeps its name, is never quite the same river from one breath to the next. He saw the whole world as a living fire, kindling and dying down in measures, and he found beneath all the strife and change a deep and hidden harmony, a single ordering reason that governed the turning of all things. He wrote in riddles, and the Greeks called him the dark or the obscure, but his vision of a world forever in motion, held together by an unseen law, has never lost its strange and quiet power. And then, as if to answer him, there arose in the Greek towns of Italy a thinker who took the opposite path entirely. His name was Parmenides, and he taught something that runs against everything the senses tell us, that change is an illusion, that motion is a kind of trick of the eye, and that what truly is can neither come to be nor pass away, but simply is whole and unmoving and complete, like a perfect sphere resting in itself. To follow reason rather than the senses, he said, is to arrive at this stillness, at being one and changeless and eternal. It is a thought that can feel almost like the edge of sleep itself, this idea that beneath all our restless coming and going there lies something that does not move at all, something simply and quietly there. Between Heraclitus, who saw only flowing, and Parmenides, who saw only the still, the philosophers who came after would spend long and pleasant hours trying to make peace between the river and the sphere. One answer to that puzzle came from a thinker named Democritus, who lived in the north of the Greek world and who laughed, they said, at the follies of mankind, and so was remembered as the laughing philosopher. He and his teacher Leucippus imagined that the world was made of countless tiny, hard, indivisible pieces, too small ever to be seen, moving forever through empty space. They called these pieces atoms, which means the things that cannot be cut, and they taught that everything you can touch or see is only atoms gathered for a while into shapes, coming together and drifting apart, while the atoms themselves go on, unchanging through the endless void. Sweetness and color and warmth, they said, are only how the atoms feel to us. In truth, there are only atoms and the emptiness between them. It was a guess, a beautiful guess made more than 2,000 years before any instrument could test it, and it lay quietly in the books of the philosophers, waiting through the long centuries until the science of a far later age would take it up again. These earliest thinkers taken together, the Greeks would later call the Presocratics, those who came before Socrates, and they shared, for all their disagreements, one quiet and revolutionary habit. They trusted the human mind to understand the world by looking and reasoning, rather than only by listening to the old tales. But there came in time, in the marble city of Athens, a different kind of thinker, who turned the questioning away from the stars and the atoms and toward people themselves. These were the sophists, traveling teachers who, for a fee, taught the young men of the city how to speak well and argue cleverly and persuade a crowd. Some of them were deep and serious men, and one of them, named Protagoras, said a thing that has echoed ever since. That man is the measure of all things, that what is true for you may differ from what is true for me, and that perhaps there is no single fixed truth standing above us all. The sophists were brilliant and useful and a little dangerous, for if cleverness alone could make the weaker argument seem the stronger, then where the city began to wonder, had truth gone and goodness and the difference between right and wrong? It is into that questioning city, in the long slant of late afternoon light, that there walks a plain man, barefoot and snub-nosed in a worn cloak. With the kindest and most maddening of habits, he asks questions. He stops a passerby who is sure he knows what justice is, or courage, or the good, and he asks him gently to explain. And the man explains, and the barefoot questioner asks another small question, and another, and bit by bit, with no harshness at all, only a patient and smiling curiosity, the certain man discovers that he does not quite know what he thought he knew. This was the way of Socrates, who wrote nothing down, who claimed to know only that he knew nothing, and who taught a whole city to love the asking of questions more than the comfort of easy answers. He was not a sophist, though some confused him with them, for he took no fee and promised no cleverness. He wanted only the truth, and he was willing to look foolish in front of anyone to find it. He drew the young around him like moths to a warm lamp, and they followed him through the streets and the colonnades, delighting in the way he turned every confident speech inside out. He believed that no one does wrong on purpose, but only through ignorance of what is truly good, and that to know the good, really to know it, is to do it. And so he thought that the care of one's own soul, the steady labor of becoming wise and just, was the most important work a person could undertake. The unexamined life, he is remembered as saying, is not worth living. And he believed that the truth was already there inside each of us, waiting only to be drawn out by the right gentle question, the way a midwife draws out what is already coming. For his mother, the story goes, had been a midwife, and he liked to say that he practiced her craft upon the soul. The city did not always thank him for it. There is always discomfort in being shown the limits of what one knows. In his 70th year, the men of Athens brought him to trial, accusing him of failing to honor the city's gods and of corrupting the young with his endless questioning. He stood before a great jury of his fellow citizens and would not flatter them, nor beg, nor pretend to be other than he was. He said that a gadfly, a small stinging fly, was sent by the god to keep a great and sluggish horse awake, and that he was that gadfly to the city of Athens. They condemned him, and the sentence was death, by drinking a cup of poison made from hemlock. His friends arranged that he might escape and urged him to, but he would not, for he had lived his whole life teaching that one must obey the laws and never do wrong, even in return for wrong. And so his long life of questioning came in the end to a quiet and sorrowful close, which we may let pass softly, as he himself is said to have faced it, calm and unafraid, talking gently with his friends about whether the soul outlives the body, until the very last of the light. But the questions did not die with him. One of those who had followed him, a young man of broad shoulders and broader vision, carried the asking onward and set it down at last in writing, in dialogue so graceful and so warm that you can almost hear the old conversations breathing through them still, with Socrates himself walking and talking through page after page, kept alive in ink. This was Plato, who found it in a quiet grove of olive trees outside the city walls, sacred to a hero named Academus, a kind of garden of learning where students could walk and think together. And from that grove it took its name, the Academy, a word that has outlived the trees by more than 2,000 years. Plato dreamed of a world behind the world. He noticed that the things we see are always imperfect and always changing. No circle drawn by any hand is ever perfectly round. No just act is ever justice itself entire. And yet we somehow understand the perfect circle and justice itself and beauty itself as though we had known them before. And so he taught that beyond this flickering world of the senses there lies a realm of perfect and unchanging forms. The form of the circle, the form of the good, the form of beauty, eternal patterns of which everything we see and touch is only a passing shadow. He told a story of prisoners chained in a cave, who take the shadows flickering on the wall before them for the whole of reality, until one of them is freed and turns and climbs painfully up toward the daylight and the sun. The philosopher, he taught, is the one who turns and climbs, and the soul, rightly turned, might rise from the dim shadows toward that pure and steady light, and remember at last the perfect things it had always somehow known. And in his garden there studied in time a quiet, watchful young man from the north, from a town called Stagira, with a different cast of mind, one who loved not only the heavens but the small particular things of the earth. This was Aristotle, who came to the academy as a boy and stayed for 20 years until his teacher died, and where Plato gazed upward toward the perfect forms in their separate realm, Aristotle bent down close to the world itself, gathering and sorting and naming. He did not believe the forms floated apart in some other place. He thought the form of a thing lived within the thing itself, in the oak within the acorn, in the grown horse within the foal. He watched the bees in their hives and the fish in the shallows and the slow unfolding of a seed into a plant. He cut open eggs at different days to see the heart begin to beat. He gathered specimens and wrote them down, founding almost single-handedly the patient study of living things. There was almost nothing he did not wish to understand. He wrote on the motions of the heavens and the falling of stones, on the parts of animals and the nature of the soul, on poetry and tragedy, on weather and dreams and memory, on the right ordering of cities, and on the very rules of reasoning itself, setting down the first careful study of how one true thought may be made to follow from another, which we still call logic. For a few years he left Greece to serve as tutor to a young prince in the north, a boy named Alexander who would later carry the Greek world to the edges of the known earth. And then he returned to Athens and founded a school of his own, near a grove sacred to Apollo of the Lyceum, where he and his students walked the covered paths as they talked, so that they came to be called the walkers, the ones who think on their feet. He believed that happiness was not a feeling that came and went, but a way of living well steadily over the whole long course of a life, a habit of the soul, like a craft patiently learned, and that virtue lay most often in the middle path, between too much and too little, in courage that is neither rashness nor cowardice, in generosity that is neither waste nor miserliness. Picture them, these gentle questioners, walking together in the cool of a garden as the day softens. There is no shouting here, no anger, only the slow back and forth of voices, the long pauses for thought, the occasional quiet laugh as someone catches the flaw in his own argument. The light goes golden through the leaves, a fountain murmurs somewhere. A student sits with his chin in his hand, turning over a hard idea the way one turns a smooth stone in the palm. To think here was not a labor but a pleasure, the deepest and most lasting pleasure they knew, sweeter even than the olive crown, because it could never be taken away. And the questions did not end with Plato and Aristotle. If anything, they widened, for the world around the philosophers was growing larger and less certain, and people longed now not only to understand the cosmos, but to find some peace within it. So there arose, in the generations that followed, whole schools of thought devoted to the simple and difficult art of living well. In a painted colonnade in Athens, a porch, which in their language was a stoa, a teacher named Zeno gathered his followers, and from that porch they took their name, the Stoics. They taught that the whole world is governed by a single reason, a divine order running through all things, and that wisdom lies in understanding what we can and cannot control. We cannot command fortune, they said, nor health, nor the deeds of other people, nor the hour of our death, but we can always command our own judgments, our own choices, the way we meet what comes. And so the wise person learns to want things to be exactly as they are, to accept the turning of the world with a calm and steady mind, untroubled by what lies beyond his power to change. It is a teaching made for quiet hours, this, the gentle laying down of all that you cannot hold. In a garden on the other side of the city, a different teacher named Epicurus drew his own students around him and taught a gentler sounding but oft mistaken doctrine. The goal of life, he said, is pleasure, but he did not mean feasting in excess, for those, he found, bring more pain than they are worth. He meant the deep and lasting pleasure of a tranquil mind and a body free from pain, the company of friends, simple food, the quiet of a garden, and above all freedom from fear of the gods, who he thought took no notice of us, and fear of death, which he reasoned could not touch us, for where death is we are not, and where we are death is not. His followers lived simply and out of the public eye, and over the gate of his garden, the story goes, there hung the kindest of invitations, promising the stranger who entered a meal of bread and water and the peace of an untroubled hour. There were others still. There were the cynics who took their name half in mockery from the word for a dog, and who taught that happiness is found by casting off all the false needs that society piles upon us, wealth and fame and comfort and good opinion, and living instead in plain accordance with nature, owning almost nothing, owing nothing to anyone. Their most famous figure, Diogenes, was said to have made his home in a great clay jar, and to have walked the marketplace by daylight with a lantern looking, he said, for an honest man. And there were the skeptics, the inquirers, who doubted most carefully of all, and taught that since the truth of deep matters can never quite be pinned down, the wisest course is to suspend judgment, to hold one's opinions lightly, and to find in that very letting go a kind of peace. For the person who claims to know nothing for certain has nothing left to be anxious about losing. And the questions they all asked were the gentlest and the greatest there are, not how to win or how to rule, but how to live, and what is good, and what it means to be just, and whether the soul outlasts the body, and how a person might find peace within himself amid all the turning of the world. They did not always agree. Indeed, they delighted in disagreeing and handed their disagreements down the generations like a torch passed hand to hand, from the watery beginnings of Thales to the calm acceptance of the Stoics across nearly 400 years of patient wondering. But beneath all the argument lay a shared and quiet faith that the world is the kind of place that rewards careful thought, that wonder is the beginning of wisdom, and that a life spent gently asking is a life well spent. Let the garden grow dim now as the talkers fall silent one by one. The fountain murmurs on in the dark, the olive leaves are still. The last student rises at last from his bench and walks home through the quiet streets, turning a question over in his mind as he goes, content to leave it unanswered until morning. For the wisest of them knew that not every question must be answered tonight, that some thoughts are best laid down gently, like a book set aside half-read, to be taken up again, fresh, with the new day's light. And so, with our minds eased of all need to know, our journey will drift next from the questions of the philosophers to a place where the people sought their answers from a different source altogether, from a smoke-wreathed shrine high on a mountainside, where a sacred voice was said to speak. But there is no need to climb there yet. For now, simply rest here in the cool, dark garden, with every question gently set aside. And so we let this part of the story rest. There is no need to remember any of it, not Thales and his water, nor the boundless, nor the atoms drifting in the void, nor the forms shining beyond the cave. Let it all fade like the last light over distant hills, and let your breath grow slow and even. You are warm and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do tonight. Sleep well. From the cool, dark gardens where the philosophers asked their gentle questions, let your mind drift now toward a place where the people of Greece sought their answers not from reason, but from something older and stranger, a sacred mountainside, wreathed in mist and silence, where the cities of the land believed they could hear the voice of a god. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, no task that cannot keep until the morning. Let yourself be carried slowly upward, into the high, cool air of Delphi, the place the Greeks called the very center of the world. The road there climbs and climbs, winding up the flank of a great gray mountain whose twin cliffs rise sheer into the sky. The mountain was called Parnassus, and on its lower slopes, in a fold of the rock high above the sea, the Greeks built the most famous sanctuary in all their world. The air grows thinner and cooler as the road ascends, sweet with the scent of pine and wild rock herbs, and far below the land falls away into a deep green valley filled with the silver of countless olive trees, an endless drifting sea of them, running all the way down to a distant bay where the water glints like beaten metal. Eagles turn slowly in the high blue air. A spring runs cold and clear from a cleft in the gray rock, the spring the Greeks called Castalia, and pilgrims paused there to drink and to wash before they climbed the last of the way. It is a place that hushes a traveler simply by its grandeur, a place that feels, somehow, set apart from the ordinary world. For here the people believed two eagles loosed by Zeus, the father of the gods, from the opposite ends of the earth had flown toward each other and met above this very spot, and so this was the navel of the world, its sacred center. To mark the place, they set up a rounded stone, carved and wreathed, which they called the omphalos, the navel stone, and they believed it stood at the heart of all things. Around it, over the long centuries, rose the great shrine of Apollo, the bright god of light and music and healing and prophecy, the god who could see clearly into what was to come. But before there was a temple, the Greeks told, there was the story of how the god came to claim the place, and it is a tale worth telling slowly as you settle toward sleep, for it is one of the oldest in their world. Long ago, they said, this mountainside belonged to the deep and ancient powers of the earth herself. Here, coiled in a shadowed cleft beside a sacred spring, dwelt a great serpent, a dragon they called the Python, an old and earthbound creature born of the soil. And down from the heights came Apollo, young and golden, the god of the bright bow, and he loosed his arrows at the serpent until it lay dead among the rocks, and so he took the sanctuary for his own. From the slain Python, the Greeks believed, the place and its priestess took their names, and ever after the god was honored there as the slayer of the serpent, the new clear light that had come to a place once ruled by the dim old powers of the ground. Even in the killing there was a debt to be paid, for the Greeks held that the god himself had to wander into exile and be cleansed of the deed before he could rule in peace, and they remembered this in their rituals long afterward. So the myth told them that prophecy at Delphi was older than Apollo, that it rose first from the earth, and that the bright god had simply become the voice through which the deep places of the world now spoke. They came from everywhere to consult the shrine, kings and farmers, generals and merchants, whole cities and lonely travelers, each carrying a question too heavy to answer alone. Should we plant our crops here or there? Should we sail across the sea or stay upon the shore? Should our city make peace with its neighbor or wait and arm ourselves? Should we send our young men out to found a colony, and if so, to what far coast? And up the winding sacred way they climbed, past a glittering hoard of treasures and statues that grateful cities had sent over the long years, gifts of gold and bronze and marble lining the path like the offerings of half the Greek world. That path had a name. It was called the Sacred Way, and it wound up the steep slope of the sanctuary in a long curving climb toward the temple at the top. Along its edges stood the treasuries, small and beautiful buildings of stone, each one raised by a different city to hold its offerings to the god and to display in marble its devotion and its pride. There was a treasury of the Athenians, built of gleaming white stone, raised after a great victory and carved with the deeds of heroes. There were treasuries of Sicyon and Siphnos and Thebes, of the islanders and the mainland cities, each a little jewel box of a building set among the rising terraces. Between them stood statues without number, bronze charioteers and marble gods and the images of victorious athletes and the spoils of war, a forest of monuments crowding the slope, so that the pilgrim climbed the sacred way as if walking through the gathered memory and rivalry of all of Greece at once. For the cities competed even in their piety, each striving to outdo its neighbors in the splendor of what it gave, and the sanctuary grew rich and crowded with their gifts. At the heart of it all, near the top of the climb, stood the great temple of Apollo, long and gray and pillared, looking out over the valley and the distant sea. And within the temple, in its innermost and most secret part, sat the woman through whom the god was said to speak. She was called the Pythia, named for the serpent the god had slain, and she was the priestess of the oracle. She is a figure half lost in the mist of time, an ordinary woman, often older, chosen from among the people of the place to leave her former life behind and give herself wholly to the service of the god. On the days when the oracle could be consulted, she would purify herself, washing in the cold water of the sacred spring, and then she would enter the dim inner chamber and seat herself upon a high three-legged stool, a tripod of bronze, set above a cleft in the rock from which, the Greeks said, a sweet strange vapor rose. She would breathe it, holding perhaps a branch of laurel, the tree sacred to Apollo, and chewing its leaves, and she would fall into a kind of waking dream, a trance in which she was no longer wholly herself. And in that altered state, the Greeks believed, the god entered into her and spoke through her mouth, so that her words were not her own but his. From her lips would come the answer, sometimes in clear speech and sometimes in murmurs and broken cries, and the priests who attended her would gather what she said and shape it, often into careful verses, and hand it down to the waiting questioner, who would carry the saying home to puzzle over, sometimes for the rest of his days. There were priests then as well as the priestess, and their role was a quiet but important one. They were the keepers of the sanctuary, the men who arranged the order of the consultations, who took the offerings, who watched over the sacrifices that had to be made before the god would answer. A goat was brought, and water was sprinkled upon it, and only if it trembled in the right way was the sign judged favorable, and the oracle declared open for the day. The priests knew the affairs of the world, for kings and envoys passed through Delphi constantly, bringing news from every corner of Greece and beyond, and so the men of the sanctuary heard much and understood much of how the world was turning. Whatever the truth of the god's voice, the answers that left Delphi were shaped by men who were wise in the ways of cities and shrewd in the dealings of power, and this too was part of the oracle's long authority. For the oracle famously did not deal in plain answers. Its sayings were like deep water, and a man could see in them whatever he most wished or most feared to see. They were riddling and double-edged, a saying that might be turned this way or that, and the Greeks both revered and gently distrusted them for it. The most famous of all these tales concerns a king of the East, Croesus, the ruler of Lydia, a man so rich that his name became a byword for wealth for all the ages after. Croesus, the story goes, wished to test the oracles of Greece before he trusted any of them, and Delphi alone, they said, answered his secret test correctly, and so he believed in it above all others. Then, thinking to make war upon the rising power of Persia, he sent to Delphi to ask whether he should march against it. The oracle answered that if Croesus made war upon the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Heartened, certain the god had promised him victory, he marched. And a great empire fell, but it was his own. Lydia was overthrown, and Croesus lost his kingdom, and only too late did he understand that the prophecy had been true in a way he had never imagined, for the great empire the god had spoken of was the one he himself had ruled. There is a quieter story told of Croesus too, one that softened the ending a little, for the Greeks did not like to leave even a fallen king without some measure of grace. When his city had been taken and his wealth was gone, Croesus is said to have sent his chains to Delphi and reproached the god for having led him to his ruin. And the answer that came back was a careful one, that not even a god may escape the share of fate that is allotted, that the prophecy had been true and the king had failed to ask its meaning, and that Apollo had in truth delayed his fall and softened it as far as the threads of destiny allowed. Whether or not such words were ever truly spoken, the tale shows how the Greeks thought about their oracle, as a voice that gave true sayings into a world where men so often heard only what they longed to hear. The Greeks told such tales not with bitterness but with a kind of rueful wonder, for they understood that the oracle was less a teller of fortunes than a mirror, showing each questioner the shape of his own hopes and his own blindness. The answer, in the end, was always partly in the asking. A man who came to Delphi already certain of what he wished to do would find that certainty reflected back at him, and a man torn between two paths would find a saying that left him torn still and must choose for himself after all. There was a deep and uncomfortable wisdom hidden in the ambiguity, the lesson that no god would do a man's choosing for him, and that the future, even when glimpsed, remained a thing each person had to walk into with his own eyes open. Yet there were times when the oracle spoke, or was understood to speak, with a force that turned the course of whole nations. The greatest of these came when the vast armies of Persia poured down into Greece, and the people of Athens sent in terror to ask the god what they should do. The first answer was dark beyond bearing, a vision of ruin and fire, and the envoys begged for a kinder word. The second answer was scarcely less grim, but it held within it a single strange and shining phrase, that a wall of wood would keep them safe. The Athenians argued long over what the god could mean. Some thought of the old thorn hedge upon their citadel, but one man, a leader of clear and stubborn vision, argued that the wooden wall meant their ships, their fleet of oared vessels drawn up along the shore. And so the Athenians put their trust not in stone walls but in timber hulls, and they met the Persian fleet in the narrow waters off the island of Salamis, and there in the press of the strait, they won one of the most famous sea battles of all history and turned back the invasion. The wooden walls had saved them, just as the riddle had said, and Delphi's fame as the place where the god guided the fate of nations was sealed for centuries. The Greeks wove the oracle into their oldest stories too, into the dark and ancient legends they told of the time before history. There was the tale of a prince of Thebes, Oedipus, whose doom was spoken at Delphi before he was even grown, that he was fated to kill his own father and marry his own mother. He fled from those he believed to be his parents, hoping to escape the saying, and in his flight he fulfilled it to the letter, killing a stranger at a crossroads who was in truth his father, and coming at last to a city where he wed a queen who was in truth his mother. It was a story the Greeks told to themselves again and again in their poetry and upon their stages, and at its heart lay the terrible idea that the oracle saw truly, and that a man's running from his fate might be the very road by which he ran toward it. Whether the listeners believed such tales as history or kept them as dark fables, the shadow of Delphi lay across them all, the sense that the god knew the shape of a life before the living of it. And the oracle shaped the world in a quieter and more lasting way as well, in the long age when the Greeks went out across the seas to found new cities. When a town grew crowded or when famine or strife drove men to seek new homes, those who would lead a band of settlers across the water came first to Delphi to ask the god where they should go and under whose protection. Time and again the oracle named a coast, a harbor, a stretch of foreign shore, and there the colonists sailed and built their new home and lived. From the shores of the Black Sea to the coasts of Italy and Sicily and far Libya, Greek cities rose where the god of Delphi had pointed, and each of them looked back to the sanctuary on the mountain as a kind of mother to its founding. In this way Delphi knit the scattered Greek world together, for wherever a Greek wandered, he carried with him the memory of the same sacred center, the same gray temple above the silver sea of olives. And carved upon that high temple where every pilgrim passed by them were short sayings that have outlasted the smoke and the riddles and the gold. The first and most famous was simply this, know yourself, and the second, gentler still, nothing in excess. The Greeks attributed these maxims to the wise men of old, the sages of their early days, and they treasured them as the distilled wisdom of their people. In all the centuries of strange prophecy, these two plain phrases may have been the truest counsel the place ever gave, that the answer a person most needs is not hidden in the smoke of a far mountain, but lies quietly within, waiting to be known, and that the good life is a life of measure, of balance, of wanting neither too much nor too little of anything under the sun. The man who truly knew himself, the Greeks understood, would not need to ask the gods so many questions, and the man who kept to nothing in excess would not so often find himself ruined, as Croesus was, by the swelling of his own pride. Delphi was not only a place of prophecy. Every 4 years it came alive with a great festival in honor of the god, with games and contests that drew competitors and crowds from across the Greek world. These were the Pythian Games, second in fame only to the games at Olympia, and they were unlike them in one beautiful way, for they began not with running and wrestling but with music. There were contests of singing to the lyre and playing upon the flute, fitting for the sanctuary of Apollo, the god of music himself, before the athletic contests and the chariot races filled the days that followed. For a little while the gray slopes rang with song and with the cheers of the gathered Greeks, and the sanctuary that spent its ordinary days in hushed and riddling quiet became, for that season, one of the great meeting places of the whole nation. Then the games would end, the visitors would scatter back to their distant cities, and Delphi would settle once more into its ancient stillness. In later ages, men have wondered long about the vapor that was said to rise from the cleft beneath the Pythia's tripod, the sweet strange breath that sent her into her trance. For centuries some doubted there had ever been any such thing, supposing it a tale the priests had spun. But the rocks beneath Delphi are crossed by faults deep in the earth, and from such faults scholars have come to think gases may once have risen faint and sweetish that could have touched the mind and loosened the tongue and brought on something like the swooning the old writers described. Whether it was truly some breath of the earth, or the laurel she chewed, or the long fasting in the dim chamber and the weight of the god's nearness upon her, no one can now say for certain. Perhaps it was all of these together. But there is a fitting mystery in it, that the most famous voice of the ancient world should have risen. The Greeks believed, from a crack in the ground, from the breath of the old earth powers that Apollo had subdued but never wholly silenced. For more than 1,000 years the oracle endured, and through all that time it held a place in the Greek imagination that no other sanctuary could match. It was pan-Hellenic, belonging to all the Greeks and to no single city, a neutral ground where rival states could meet, and where the whole scattered nation felt itself, for a moment, to be one people gathered before one god. Its sayings were copied and pondered, its treasuries grew heavy with gold, its priests advised kings, its maxims were learned by children. Through wars and the rise and fall of cities, Delphi remained the place the Greeks turned to when the future was dark and the question too heavy to bear alone. But no shrine lasts forever, and slowly, over the long centuries, the voice of Delphi grew faint. As the old beliefs gave way to new ways of seeing the world, fewer pilgrims climbed the winding road, and the answers came less often, and the rich gifts were carried away by conquerors who valued the gold above the god. There came a day, the old story tells, when an emperor of a later age sent to ask the oracle one last question, and the answer that came back was a kind of farewell, that the god's hall had fallen, that the bright spring had fallen silent, that the speaking water was stilled. Whether those words were truly spoken there or were only put into the oracle's mouth long after, they make a fitting close, for in time the temple did fall quiet, the fires went out, the Pythia sat no more upon her tripod, and the great sanctuary on the mountain was left to the silence and the wind. Picture the shrine now in the failing light of evening, when the last pilgrims have gone back down the mountain and the sacred way lies empty and still. The treasuries gleam faintly in the dusk, the great temple stands gray and silent against the darkening peaks of Parnassus. The cold spring runs on, murmuring to itself in the gathering shadow. The eagles have gone to roost in the high crags. A single lamp burns somewhere within the temple, and its glow falls soft upon the worn stone and upon the rounded navel stone that the Greeks believed to be the center of the earth, and the whole sacred place, so full of voices by day, settles into a vast and ancient quiet. There is a deep peace in this high place at nightfall, the peace of a question finally laid down. For everyone who climbed that long road came burdened with some heavy not knowing, and whatever the oracle gave them, the climbing itself and the cold sweet air and the silver sea of olives far below must have eased something in them the way the dark eases something in you now. The god has gone quiet, the vapor has thinned, the riddles can wait until morning. There is nothing more tonight that needs to be known. And from this hushed and sacred mountain, our journey will drift next back down into the warm and crowded heart of the city itself, into the open marketplace and the great curved theater carved into a hillside, where the people gathered not to hear the gods, but to laugh and weep together at the stories of themselves. But there is no need to descend yet. For now, simply rest here in the high, cool air of Delphi, with every question gently set aside. And so we let this part of the story rest. There is no need to remember any of it. Let it fade like the last light over distant hills, and let your breath grow slow and even. You are warm and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do tonight. Sleep well. From the high, cool silence of the sacred places, let your mind drift now back down into the warm and crowded heart of the city, where the people gathered not to hear the gods, but to meet one another, to buy and to sell, to argue and to gossip, and on the great festival days, to sit together beneath the open sky and watch the stories of themselves unfold. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, no task that cannot keep until the morning. Let yourself settle into the hum of the marketplace at the close of day, and the hush of a vast crowd as a play begins. Come first into the agora, the open marketplace at the foot of the hill, in the bright bustle of the morning. The word itself meant simply a gathering place, and that is what it was, the place where everyone sooner or later came. It lay in a broad open space below the citadel, a roughly level square of beaten earth, bordered by buildings and crossed by a sacred road, where the whole life of the city flowed together. Beneath long colonnades that gave shade from the climbing sun, merchants spread their wares on cloths and trestles, olives glistening in clay jars, figs and grapes heaped in baskets, fish silver and fresh from the morning's catch, pots and lamps and bolts of dyed cloth, garlands of flowers, loaves still warm from the oven. The air was thick with the smell of bread and brine and crushed herbs, with the cries of the sellers, the haggling of buyers, the bray of a laden donkey, the laughter of friends meeting in the crowd. It was noisy and warm and wonderfully alive. The marketplace had its own quiet order beneath the seeming confusion. The sellers of each kind of thing gathered together in their own part of the square, so that a man would speak of going to the fish, or to the wine, or to the myrtle, as we might name a street, and find there everything of its sort laid out side by side. There were the women who sold ribbons, and the men who sold charcoal and honey and incense, and the dealers in slaves, and the perfume sellers whose corner of the agora was a favorite place to linger and to gossip. Around the edges stood the workshops of the craftsmen, the potters with their wheels and their kilns, the bronze workers in the smoke and clang of their forges, the leather cutters and the makers of shields, the carvers of marble, the cobblers who would fit a sandal to your foot while you waited. The everyday goods of life moved through this one open space, grain brought in by sea from far across the water, oil pressed from the silver olive groves of the countryside, wool and timber and iron, the salt fish that fed the poor and the honeyed cakes that pleased the rich. Money itself was a newer thing than the marketplace, and you could watch it being weighed and counted in the agora. At their tables sat the money changers, the men who knew the worth of every coin from every city, for each city struck its own, stamped with its own emblem: an owl, a turtle, a bee, a bunch of grapes, the badge of the place that made it. A trader come from across the sea would bring his foreign silver to these tables, and the changer would test it, weigh it, and give him the local coin in exchange, taking his small portion for the service. These same men lent money and kept it safe and stood surety for debts, and from their plain tables in the open market grew, in time, something very like the banking of the world to come. The smallest coins were tiny slivers of silver, so little that a man might carry them tucked inside his cheek, and with a handful of them he could buy a day's food, a measure of barley, a fish, a cup of wine. But the agora was never only a place of buying and selling. It was the place where the city did its thinking out loud. Here, among the stalls and the strolling crowds, the philosophers walked and questioned, and one of them, a stonemason's son with a snub nose and a way of asking troublesome questions, was so constant a fixture of the marketplace that to find him you had only to come down to the agora in the morning and look among the stalls and the workshops, for there he would be, talking with whoever would talk with him. Here men gathered in knots beneath the colonnades to argue the news, to weigh a coming vote, to debate whether the city should sail or stay, to mourn or to boast over the doings of the day. Here the news of the world arrived, carried by sailors fresh off the ships, and spread from mouth to mouth across the square faster than any messenger could carry it. To stroll the agora was to take the pulse of the whole city at once, its trade and its talk, its quarrels and its friendships, all mingling in the dust and the warm slanting light. The great long buildings that framed the square were called stoas, roofed colonnades open along one side, with a wall behind and a row of columns before, so that a man could walk their length in the shade and look out upon the bustle of the market. These stoas were the shelter and the comfort of the agora, a refuge from the midday sun and the winter rain, and people gathered in them to talk and to do business and simply to pass the time. One of them, painted along its inner wall with great scenes of battle, was so admired that it gave its name to a whole way of thinking, for in later days a teacher would gather his pupils there beneath the painted wall, and his followers came to be called the men of the porch, the Stoics, after the painted stoa where it all began. So even the architecture of the marketplace, the plain practical shelter from the weather, left its mark upon the language and the thought of the world that came after. Around the open square stood also the buildings of the city's public life, for the agora was the seat of government as much as of trade. Here the council met in its round chamber to manage the daily affairs of the city. Here, near the heart of it, stood a round house where the officials kept watch through the night, and where the sacred hearth fire of the city was tended so that it should never go out, for the city's fire was the city's life, and its keeping was a holy trust. Here stood the office where the public records were kept, the laws and the decrees and the accounts, and the standard weights and measures against which a buyer might check the honesty of a seller, the official measure of grain and the official measure of wine, kept in the market so that no man could cheat another and deny it. And here the law courts met, where great juries of ordinary citizens, hundreds of men chosen by lot, sat to hear the disputes and the crimes of the city and to render judgment, dropping their little tokens into urns to cast their votes. To be a citizen of such a city was to spend a great part of one's life in this open square, and the men of the city felt it keenly. A man who kept always to his own house and his own fields, who took no part in the talk and the business and the governing of the marketplace, was looked upon with a certain pity, even a certain scorn, for he was thought to be living only half a life. The full life, the proper life of a free man, was lived out of doors and in company in the give and take of the agora, where a man met his fellows and argued with them and learned the news and took his part in the common affairs. The household, the women and the children, and the quiet indoor world of weaving and cooking and the raising of the young, was the other half of life, kept apart and private, while the agora was the bright public stage on which a citizen played his part before the eyes of his fellows. A day in this world had its own gentle rhythm, marked not by clocks, for there were none, but by the slow climbing and falling of the sun. A man rose at first light, for the morning was the time of business, and broke his fast simply, perhaps with bread dipped in wine. Then he went down to the agora when the market was full and the crowd at its thickest, in the cool of the early hours before the heat came on. There he did his buying or watched it done by a servant, and met his friends and lingered to talk. As the sun climbed toward noon, the heat grew heavy. The crowd thinned, and men retired to the shade of the stoas or went home to rest and to eat the main meal of the middle day. Toward evening, as the light softened and the heat eased, men gathered again, and the day might end with a supper among friends, reclining in the lamplight over wine and conversation, while the city quieted around them and the stars came out over the rooftops. And on certain days, the whole city would set its trading and its arguing aside and climb the slope of a nearby hill to a great curved bowl of stone seats carved into the hillside, open to the sky, looking out over the rooftops to the distant gleam of the sea. This was the theater, and here, in the bright morning of a festival, tens of thousands of people would gather, packed close upon the worn stone tiers, hushed and waiting. Below them lay a round dancing floor of beaten earth, and behind it a low building with a painted face. And as the sun rose higher, the players would come out, masked, robed, their voices trained to carry up and up across that vast curved space to the very topmost rows, where a whispered word could still be heard, so cunningly was the great bowl shaped. The theater had been born long before out of worship. It grew up in the festivals of Dionysus, the god of the vine and of wine, of growth and of wild release, whose worship was older and stranger than the orderly cult of the city's other gods. In his honor, in the early spring, the people held a great festival, and at its heart was a chorus of men who sang and danced in his praise, circling an altar in the open air, chanting the old hymns. From this circling, singing chorus, the Greeks themselves believed, the theater arose. For the tradition told that a man named Thespis, performing at one of these festivals in the 6th century before our era, did a new and remarkable thing. He stepped out from the chorus and spoke alone, taking on a character, answering the chorus and being answered by it, so that for the first time there was not only song about the god and the heroes, but a person standing there pretending to be another, speaking as that other. This was the birth of the actor, and from his name, Thespis, the players of every age since have been called the Thespians. What Thespis began, others swiftly enlarged. The festivals of Dionysus became great contests in which playwrights competed for the prize, each presenting his works before the assembled city and a panel of judges chosen by lot. A wealthy citizen would be called upon to bear the cost of training and dressing a chorus, a duty of honor and expense, and the rivalry between these sponsors was as keen as the rivalry between the poets. For days the city would give itself over to the plays, the law courts closed, the prisoners were let out to attend, and even the poorest could go, for the city in time paid the small price of admission for those who could not afford it, so that no citizen need be shut out from the festival of the god. To win the prize was a glory that a poet might remember all his life, and to be defeated, even unjustly as it seemed to him, was a grief he might never forget. The first of the three great masters of tragedy was Aeschylus, who had fought as a young man in the wars against the great empire of the East, and who counted that soldiering and not his plays as the achievement of his life. It was Aeschylus who took the art that Thespis had begun and made it grander and deeper, adding a second actor so that two characters might face one another upon the stage, and so making true drama possible, the clash of person against person, will against will. His tragedies were vast and solemn, full of gods and curses, and the slow working out of fate across the generations of a doomed house. His great linked trilogy told of a king come home from a long war, murdered by his own wife in his bath, and of the son who avenged that murder by killing his mother in turn, and of how at last the endless cycle of blood for blood was broken, not by more killing, but by the founding of a court of law, where men might judge and be judged, and the chain of vengeance be set aside. In that ending, Aeschylus gave the city a story about itself, about how it had risen out of the old dark world of the blood feud into the rule of law. After him came Sophocles, who lived a long and honored life and won the prize again and again, more often than any other. He added a third actor to the stage, so that the dramas grew richer still in their weaving of character against character, and he is said to have brought the painted scenery to its fullness. His tragedies turned upon the proud and noble man brought low, not by simple wickedness, but by some flaw or blindness in a nature otherwise great. He told the terrible story of the king who, fleeing a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother, fled straight into its fulfillment, and who, when at last he learned the whole dreadful truth of what he had unknowingly done, put out his own eyes in his anguish. And he told of the king's daughter, a girl who defied the law of the city to bury her dead brother as the gods required, and went to her death for it, caught between the duty owed to the family and the duty owed to the state, neither of which could be wholly denied. These were not simple tales of good and evil. They asked hard questions and gave no easy answers, and the city wept over them and went home thinking. The third of the great tragedians was Euripides, younger than the others, a restless and questioning spirit who brought the high heroes of legend down closer to the level of ordinary men and women. His characters were more human, more troubled, more torn by passion and doubt, and he gave a new depth and a new sympathy to the women of the old stories, to wronged wives and grieving mothers and women driven to terrible deeds by terrible suffering. He wrote of a foreign princess betrayed by the husband for whom she had given up everything, who took a revenge so dreadful that the very telling of it chilled the blood. He was less honored in his own lifetime than the others, winning the prize seldom, for his questioning ways and his two human heroes unsettled the older taste. But in the ages that came after, his plays were loved and copied and remembered perhaps more than any. These tragedies were performed in a way that would seem strange to us, and yet was perfectly suited to that vast open bowl of stone under the morning sky. The players wore masks, large and stylized, fixed in a single expression of grief or rage or calm, so that a man in the highest row, who could not have read the small movements of a real face so far below, could yet see at a glance who spoke and what passion drove him. The masks let a handful of actors play many parts, changing from king to messenger to queen with a change of mask and robe, and they let men play the women, for women did not act upon the stage. The actors wore long robes and, in tragedy, raised shoes that gave them height and dignity, and they moved with a slow and measured grace and spoke in a heightened, chanting verse that carried across the open air. And always between and around the speeches of the actors there was the chorus. The chorus was the heart that the theater had grown up around, that circle of singers and dancers who filled the round dancing floor, the orchestra, the dancing place below the seats. They were a dozen or 15 men moving together in patterns, singing in unison the great odes that divided the acts of the play, and they were in a way the voice of the city itself within the drama, the elders, the townsfolk, the watching crowd. They reflected upon the action, lamented the sorrows, warned and questioned and remembered, and their long swaying songs gave the audience a space to breathe between the sharp clashes of the actors, a tide that rose and fell beneath the story. The painted building behind the dancing floor was called the Skene, and it served as the palace or the temple before which the action was set, with its central door from which the kings came forth, and it was from this Skene, this scene building, that we have our very word for the scene of a play. The stories the tragedies told were the old deep stories of the land, of kings and gods and fate, of pride and grief and the long shadows that fall upon a house. The tales were often sorrowful ones, of mortals brought low by their own blindness, and the great crowd would weep openly together in the sunlight, and yet there was a strange comfort in that shared weeping, a sense that one's own private griefs were part of something older and larger and somehow bearable, wept over together beneath the open sky. The Greeks had a word for what they felt at the end of such a play, a kind of cleansing, a washing out of pity and fear, so that a man came down from the theater lightened, emptied of his own small sorrows by the great sorrows he had shared. And then, to lighten the load further, there was laughter. For these same people who wept at the tragedies also roared with delight at the comedies, those wild and bawdy and biting plays that mocked everything and everyone, the politicians, the philosophers, the generals, the gods themselves, and not least the audience in their seats. The great master of this old comedy was Aristophanes, a poet of wicked wit and boundless invention, who put living men of the city upon the stage by name and made the whole population laugh at them. He mocked the war that dragged on year after year, and imagined the women of the city banding together to force their husbands to make peace. He mocked the philosophers and set the snub-nosed questioner of the marketplace up in a basket among the clouds, talking nonsense about the heavens to the delight of the crowd. He mocked the new fashions in tragedy and staged a contest in the underworld between two dead playwrights for the throne of poetry. Nothing was too sacred to be laughed at. The most powerful men in the city would sit and watch themselves ridiculed before the whole population and laugh along or pretend to. There was a great healthy freedom in it, this willingness to mock and to be mocked, and the laughter rolled down the stone tiers in waves and rose up into the bright air over the city. Think of what it meant to sit there among them, 30,000 souls upon the warm stone, hushed as one when the chorus sang, weeping as one at the fall of a king, shaking as one with helpless laughter at a jester's jibe. For a few hours the butcher and the philosopher, the sailor and the magistrate, the rich man and the poor, were all simply an audience together, breathing as one body, given over to the same story. The theater, like the agora below it, was a place where the city became, for a little while, a single thing, a great gathered crowd of people discovering, in the stories on the dancing floor, the truth of their own shared hearts. And what they saw there did not stay upon the hillside. They carried it back down into the agora and argued over it among the stalls, which poet had deserved the prize, which actor had spoken most nobly, which line had struck closest to home, so that the talk of the theater and the talk of the marketplace were forever flowing into one another, the two great gathering places of the city's life. Let the day soften now toward evening. The play is ended, the masked players have made their bows, the judges have cast their votes and crowned the victor with a wreath of ivy, sacred to the god of the festival, and the great crowd rises, stretching and murmuring, and streams slowly down the hillside in the golden light, talking quietly of what they have seen. Below them the agora is closing for the night, the stalls coming down, the last figs sold, the money changers folding away their coins in their scales, the merchants counting their takings and packing their cloths, the colonnades of the stoas emptying into shadow. A lamplighter moves along the edge of the marketplace, and one by one the small flames bloom in the dusk. The craftsmen bank their forged fires, the potter covers his wheel. The city, having spent the day weeping and laughing and arguing and trading together, turns at last toward home and rest. And in the houses around the square the evening settles in, the family gathered, the lamp lit, the simple supper laid, bread and olives and cheese and a little wine mixed with water, for these were not a people of rich feasting on ordinary days. The talk runs over the doings of the agora and the wonders of the theater, and slowly the voices drop, and the lamp burns low, and the household quiets towards sleep beneath the same stars that wheel over the empty marketplace and the dark and silent bowl of the theater on the hill. So we let this part of the story rest. There is no need to remember any of it, not the names of the poets nor the shape of the great stone seats. Let it fade like the last light over distant hills, and let your breath grow slow and even. You are warm and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do tonight. The market is closed, the play is over, the lamps are burning low across the quiet city. Sleep well. From the warm stone theater and the lamplit marketplace, where the small bright world of the city gathered to weep and to laugh, let your mind drift now northward, beyond the familiar plains, into a wilder green country of mountains and horses and wide cold rivers. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, no task that cannot keep until the morning. You can let the words settle over you like the soft dust of a summer evening, and let yourself drift down, slowly and gently, towards sleep, into the story of a young man who rode out to carry the ways of Greece farther than anyone had ever dreamed. The country we are traveling to was called Macedon, and it lay to the north of the cities you have come to know, in a land of high pastures and timbered hills and rivers that ran cold and fast down from the mountains. The Greeks of the south, with their marble temples and their crowded harbors, had long looked upon the Macedonians as half-wild cousins, a people of herdsmen and horsemen who spoke a rough and distant kind of Greek, and were ruled not by assemblies but by kings. It was a hardy land, good for raising horses and tough men, and for a long time it had stood at the edges of the Greek story, on the margins, watching while the great events unfolded farther south. But the edges of a story have a way of moving toward the center, and in the years we are about to speak of, Macedon would step out of the shadows of its mountains and change the world. The man who began this was a king named Philip, the second of that name, who came to the throne of Macedon in a time of weakness and danger, with enemies pressing on every side and his kingdom in disorder. Philip was a soldier and a schemer of rare gifts, patient where he needed to be patient and swift where swiftness served him. And over the course of a long reign, he took the loose and quarrelsome kingdom he had inherited and forged it into the most formidable power the Greek world had ever seen. He reformed the army from the ground upward, and it is worth pausing over what he made, for it was the instrument upon which everything that followed would turn. He took the ordinary farmers and herdsmen of his kingdom and trained them into a disciplined infantry, and he gave them a weapon that became the emblem of Macedonian war, a long pike of cornel wood, longer than 2 men are tall, called the sarissa. The men were drilled to stand in deep blocks, shoulder to shoulder, their pikes leveled in row upon row, so that an enemy facing them met a hedge of iron points before he could come anywhere near. This formation, the phalanx, was slow and heavy and hard to turn, but against it the older armies of Greece, with their shorter spears, found themselves outreached and overborne. And on the wings Philip set his cavalry, the proud horsemen of the Macedonian nobility, the companions, who would charge home at the decisive moment while the phalanx pinned the enemy in place. Philip used this machine of war patiently, year after year, to bring his neighbors and then the cities of Greece itself under his sway, until at last, on a field called Chaeronea, the combined armies of the southern cities were broken, and Macedon stood master of Greece. Into this rising kingdom in the city of Pella, a son was born to Philip, and they named him Alexander. He was raised in a court that loved both war and learning, among horses and weapons and the talk of soldiers, and from his earliest years he showed a restless, burning energy, a hunger to excel, a longing to match the heroes of the old songs. For a teacher his father chose, when the boy was 13, none other than the quiet, watchful philosopher whose calm gaze we have met before among the olive groves, Aristotle himself, the keenest mind of that age. In a green retreat away from the bustle of the court, the philosopher taught the restless young prince to love the old poems, the names of the stars, the shapes of plants and animals, the ordering of the world. He gave him a copy of the great war poem of Troy, the tale of Achilles and the long siege, and the boy took it to his heart so wholly that in later years, even in the farthest places of his wandering, he is said to have slept with that worn book beneath his pillow, dreaming of the heroes of long ago whose deeds he longed to surpass. The learning stayed with him ever after, a love of knowledge braided through with a love of glory, and the two would drive him to the ends of the earth. There is a story told of him as a boy that catches him whole, and it is a gentle one to hold as you settle toward sleep. A great black horse had been brought to his father's court, a magnificent animal, but so wild and fierce that none of the king's grooms could mount him, and the men were ready to send the beast away as useless. But the young prince had been watching, and he had seen something the others had missed. He had noticed that the horse was frightened of his own shadow, shying and rearing at the dark shape that moved upon the ground before him. Quietly the boy took the bridle, and he turned the great animal gently to face the sun, so that the shadow fell away behind him and was no longer in his sight. And as the shadow vanished, the trembling stopped and the horse grew calm, and the boy stroked his neck and spoke to him softly, and then sprang up onto his back and rode him. That horse was named Bucephalus for the broad mark upon his head, and he would carry Alexander to the ends of the known world, and the two of them would grow old together across thousands of miles of road. It is a kind image to keep in mind, a boy calming a frightened thing simply by turning it toward the light. Philip did not live to see what his son would become. He was struck down by an assassin's knife at a wedding feast in the midst of his power, and the throne and the army he had built passed to Alexander, who was then only 20 years old. The young king moved quickly to secure what he had inherited, putting down rivals at home and overawing the cities of Greece, which had stirred at the news of Philip's death in the hope of throwing off Macedonian rule. And then, his rear made safe behind him, he turned his face toward the great task that his father had planned but never lived to begin: the invasion of Persia, the vast and ancient empire that lay across the narrow water to the east, stretching away beyond all knowing, the empire whose kings had twice in earlier generations sent their armies against the Greek homeland. In the spring he crossed the straits with an army that was not large by the standards of the empire he meant to challenge, perhaps 30 or 40,000 foot and a few thousand horse, and he stepped ashore in Asia. They say that as the ships approached the far bank, he hurled his spear from the deck so that it stuck quivering in the soil, claiming the continent as a gift won by the spear. And then before he marched, he turned aside to the ruins of Troy, the city of the old poem he loved so well, and there he honored the tomb of Achilles, the hero he had carried in his heart since boyhood, laying a wreath upon the grave in the old fashion. It is a touching thing that a conqueror at the head of an army should pause first at a poet's grave. Now we must speak of the years of marching and of battle that filled the rest of his life, for he was, above all, a conqueror, and his road was a long one. Let us pass over the clash of arms gently, as the land itself has long since done, telling these things calmly and without excitement, the way one might recall events that happened to other people in another age. The first great meeting came at a river called the Granicus, where the local lords of the western provinces had gathered along the far bank to bar his way. Alexander led his companions across the running water and up the slope into the waiting line, and in the press of that fight he came near to death, his helmet split by a blow, saved at the last by a friend's quick hand. But the line gave way, and the western door of the empire stood open, and one by one, the Greek cities of the Asian coast opened their gates to him. The great king of Persia himself, Darius, came against him the following year, on a narrow coastal plain near a town called Issus, where the mountains crowd close to the sea. Here the very vastness of the Persian host worked against it, for there was no room to spread out and use its numbers, and the long sarissas and the charge of the companions found their mark. Alexander drove straight toward the place where Darius stood in his chariot, and the great king, seeing the battle turning and the spears coming near, turned and fled the field, leaving behind his camp and his treasure, and even his own mother and wife and children, who fell into Alexander's hands. The young king, they say, treated the royal women with courtesy and honor, and this too became part of his legend, the conqueror who could be gentle with the helpless. Rather than chase the fleeing king at once into the heart of the empire, Alexander turned south down the long coast to secure the harbors of the sea before he plunged inland. Most of the cities yielded, but one did not. The island fortress of Tyre, an ancient and wealthy trading city set upon a rock in the sea, half a mile from the shore, closed its gates and trusted to its walls and its water. And so there began a siege that has been remembered ever since for its patience and its labor, for Alexander denied the city, set his men to building a great causeway, a mole of stone and timber, out across the water toward the island, so that he might bring his engines to the walls. For 7 long months the work went on, the men laboring under the missiles of the defenders, the sea swallowing their stones, the causeway creeping outward foot by foot until at last it reached the rock and the walls were breached and the city fell. We need not dwell on what followed, for the ending of sieges is a hard thing, and the land has long since forgotten it. Let us remember instead the slow building of a road across the sea. From there he passed on into Egypt, the old land of the Nile, where the people, weary of their Persian overlords, welcomed him not as a conqueror but as a deliverer, and the priests of that ancient country greeted him as a son of their gods. There, on a strip of land between the sea and a quiet lagoon, near the western mouth of the great river, he founded a city and gave it his own name, Alexandria. He is said to have walked out the line of its walls himself, and where there was no chalk to mark the boundary, the workmen marked it with barley meal, so that the birds came down and ate the line, which the seers took for an omen that the city would feed people from many lands. And so it would. Of all the many cities he founded across the world, this one would grow greatest, a place of harbors and learning, of a great library and a tall lighthouse. Though all of that lay far in the future on the day the young king paced out its walls beside the sea. Far inland, meanwhile, Darius had gathered the full strength of his vast empire, and he chose his ground carefully this time, a wide flat plain near a place called Gaugamela, beyond the 2 great rivers where his numbers could spread out and his scythed chariots could run. The 2 armies met there on an autumn day, and the Persian host stretched far across the plain, so many that the watchfires at night were like the lights of a great city. But numbers are not everything, and the battle turned upon a single moment, when Alexander, leading his companions, found or made a gap in the enemy line and drove his wedge of horsemen straight toward the center where Darius stood. And once again the great king, seeing the spears bearing down upon him, turned and fled, and once again, with their king gone, the great host melted away. The empire of Persia, which had stood for 200 years and ruled from the Aegean to the mountains of India, had lost its heart. Alexander rode on into the great cities of the empire, into Babylon with its walls and its hanging gardens, into Susa with its treasuries, and at last into Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, the proud heart of the Persian kings. There in the great palace, a fire broke out that consumed the halls, whether by accident or by design no one can now say for certain. Darius himself fled eastward, a king without a kingdom, and was at the last betrayed and killed by his own followers, found dying in a wagon by the side of the road. Alexander, coming upon the body, is said to have covered it with his own cloak and ordered it sent home for a royal burial. The man he had pursued across half a world he honored in death, and so the long contest between them ended quietly on a dusty road with a cloak laid over a fallen king. He might have turned back then, with the great empire won and the old quarrel between Greece and Persia settled forever. But something in him would not turn back, some restlessness, some longing for what lay always just beyond the next range of hills. And so he marched on, eastward and ever eastward, into lands no Greek had ever seen. Picture the young king and his weary, faithful men crossing deserts where the sun lay like a weight upon the shoulders, climbing mountains so high the snow never left them, fording rivers wider than any in their homeland, passing through provinces of strange and ancient custom. He marched into the high cold lands they called Bactria and Sogdiana, beyond the rivers, a country of mountains and oases where the people fought him from rock to rock, and the war dragged on for years among the crags. There in those far provinces he took a wife, a noble woman of the country named Roxana, joining himself to the land he had conquered. And still he went on over the great mountains and down at last into the warm green valleys of India, where the rains fell in sheets and the forests teemed with creatures the Greeks had only half believed in. Here at a river called the Hydaspes, swollen and brown with the monsoon rains, he met a king of that country named Porus, a tall and noble man who waited for him on the far bank with an army that had something the Greeks had never faced in battle before: elephants, great gray beasts arrayed across the front like living towers. Alexander crossed the flooded river by night upstream in the dark and the rain and brought Porus to battle on the farther shore. It was a hard fight against the elephants and the brave men of India, but it ended as the others had ended. And when the captured king was brought before him, beaten and wounded, and Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, Porus answered simply, like a king, and Alexander, admiring him, gave him back his kingdom and made him a friend. It is one of the gentler endings in all that long road of war. Yet it was here, too, in the green Indian country, that the old black horse Bucephalus, who had carried him since boyhood, grew weary at last and died, and the grieving king founded a city by the river and gave it the horse's name, so that the faithful animal might be remembered as long as the city stood. And it was here, beyond the river, at the very edge of everything, that the long road finally bent toward its close. For his men, who had followed him so faithfully across half the world, grew weary at last for home. They had heard there were yet more rivers ahead, and more kings, and more vast lands beyond the rain, and their hearts failed them, not for fear but for longing, for the wives and children and the green hills they had left behind so many years before. By a swollen river in the rain they would go no farther, and for once the king who had bent the whole world to his will could not bend the hearts of his own soldiers. He shut himself in his tent for 3 days, they say, but in the end he yielded and turned the great army back toward the west. He raised great altars there to mark the farthest edge of his wandering, and then began the long road home. That journey home was longer and harder than any battle, for he led part of his army back through a terrible desert where the sun and the thirst killed more men than all the enemies he had faced. But he came through at last to the old cities of the empire, to Susa and to Babylon, and there he set himself to the great work that had grown in him through all those years of marching, to bind together into one the many peoples he had conquered. Everywhere he had gone he had founded cities and named many of them after himself, so that across that vast sweep of the world there bloomed, one after another, new towns laid out in the Greek manner, with their marketplaces and their colonnades where Greek and Persian and a dozen other peoples mingled. He took to wearing some of the dress of the Persian kings, and at Susa he held a great wedding feast where thousands of his soldiers married women of Persia all together in a single day. He dreamed, it is said, of a world made one, of all these many peoples joined under a single sky, sharing in a single great way of living. It was a vast and perhaps impossible dream, and not all of his own men loved it, for they had not marched so far to see their king take on the manners of those they had beaten. But he chased the dream all the same, to the very end. And the end came soon and quietly in the great old city of Babylon. He had plans yet, fleets to build and farther shores to seek, for the restlessness never left him. But in the heat of a Babylonian summer he fell ill of a fever, and the fever did not break. For days he lay in the palace by the river, growing weaker, and the soldiers who loved him filed past his bed one by one, and he could no longer speak, but only lift his hand to them as they passed. And then in the month we would call June, in the year we count as 323 before the Common Era, he died. He was not yet 33 years old. The boy who had calmed a frightened horse by turning it toward the light had ridden in a dozen years off the very edge of the map, and now his long ride was over, far from the green horse country of his birth, with the wide empire he had won lying all around him like a dream he would not wake from. We may let that ending rest softly, as such things must. What he was in himself is hard to hold in a single image, for he was many things at once. He was generous and he was terrible, capable of great tenderness toward the helpless and of sudden rage toward his friends. He drove himself harder than he drove any of his men, first into every breach, first across every river, his body marked with the scars of a dozen wounds. He was a man of enormous gifts and enormous hungers, and he burned through his short life like a fire through dry grass, brilliant and consuming and soon spent. The Greeks who came after made of him a legend, half history and half dream, and the peoples of the East wove him into their own tales, so that for centuries his name traveled the roads he had opened, farther even than his armies had gone. For what he left behind was not, in the end, the empire itself, which scattered soon enough among his quarreling captains, the great generals who had marched at his side and who now fell to fighting over the pieces. He left no grown son to follow him, only the unborn child of Roxana and the loyalty of hard, ambitious men, and that was not enough to hold so vast a thing together. What he left behind was something gentler and far more lasting than any throne, a world grown suddenly wide, its far corners stitched together by Greek roads and Greek speech and Greek ways of seeing, so that an idea born in a marketplace beneath the marble hill might now travel, unbroken, all the way to the warm green valleys of the east. The speech and the gods and the art of Greece had taken root in soil thousands of miles from their home, and had begun to blend with the older wisdom of the lands he had crossed. The small, bright world of the cities had spilled outward across the whole of the known earth, and would never again be small. Let the great roads grow quiet now in the gathering dusk. The marching is over, the maps are filled, the young king sleeps at last, his long ride done, his restless heart finally still. And out of all that motion and distance there settles a vast new quiet, a wide world newly joined, breathing slowly under one great spreading sky. What his captains would make of it, the kingdoms they would carve from his conquests, and the long age that would follow, is another story, and one that need not trouble you tonight. For now there is only the dusk, and the silence after so much striving, and the great roads falling still all around you. There is no need to remember any of it. Let it fade like the last light over distant hills, and let your breath grow slow and even. You are warm and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do tonight. Think, if you wish, of the boy on the black horse in the green country before any of it began, turning the frightened animal toward the sun until the trembling stopped. Rest now. Sleep well. From the wide eastern dusk where the young king's long ride came at last to rest, let your mind drift now into the soft golden afterglow of all that striving, the long, calm, luminous age that followed, when the ways of Greece had spread across the whole of the known world and settled slowly into something richer and gentler than before. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, no task that cannot keep until the morning. Let yourself be carried one final time into this wide and peaceful world, and then, when it has eased you all the way down, gently home again to your own quiet room. The conqueror was gone. He had died in Babylon in the great palace by the river, in the early summer of the year we would call 323 before the Common Era, not yet 33 years old, having marched from the shores of Greece to the edges of India and back again. He left behind him the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the cold rivers of Macedon to the warm plains of the Indus, and he left it, the old story says, to the strongest, for when his generals asked him, in his last hours, to whom he meant to give his kingdom, he could only murmur that it should go to the most able among them. He had no grown son to follow him, only an unborn child and a half-brother of feeble mind, and so the great empire, one in a single dazzling decade, was left without a master. What followed was not a single inheritance, but a long unraveling and a long settling, and out of it came the world we are going to wander through tonight. The generals who had marched with him, the men who had fought beside him at the great battles in the east, now turned to the question of who should rule and what each should hold. They were called in the Greek of that age the Diadochi, the successors, and they were hard, capable, ambitious men, soldiers grown gray in the conqueror's service, and for 40 years and more they fought one another across the vast inheritance, drawing and redrawing its borders with their armies. You need not follow the wars themselves closely. They were many and tangled, and the names of the battles need not trouble your rest. It is enough to know the shape of the thing. Slowly, over those decades of striving, the single empire broke along its natural seams into a handful of great kingdoms, each ruled by a successor and his descendants, each a Greek crown set over an ancient land. And 3 of these kingdoms grew larger and lasted longer than the rest, and between them they held the heart of the Hellenistic world. In Egypt, in the rich green valley of the Nile, one of the conqueror's most trusted companions, a shrewd and careful man named Ptolemy, made himself master. He took the old land of the pharaohs, the oldest kingdom on earth, and he ruled it from the new city by the sea, and he founded a line of kings and queens that would hold Egypt for nearly 300 years, the longest lasting of all the successor houses, the Ptolemies. They were Greek kings ruling over an Egyptian people, and they took up the old forms of the pharaohs, the temples and the crowns and the sacred titles, even as they spoke Greek among themselves and filled their court with Greek learning. Across the sea and far to the east, over the broad span of Asia, over Syria and Mesopotamia and Persia, the lands the conqueror had wrested from the old Persian king, another general named Seleucus built the largest of the kingdoms. The realm of the Seleucids stretched at its height from the shores of the Mediterranean almost to India, an enormous and various empire of many peoples and many tongues, held together by Greek cities planted like seeds across its width, by garrisons and governors and the long roads that the old Persian kings had built before them. It was too vast in the end to hold whole, and over the centuries its edges would loosen and fall away, but for a long while it was the great power of the East. And in the old homeland itself, in rugged Macedon north of Greece, a third line came at last to rule, the Antigonids, descended from a one-eyed old general named Antigonus and his son Demetrius. They held Macedon and kept a heavy hand upon the cities of Greece to the south, the proud old cities that had once been free and now found themselves clients and subjects of a northern crown. The little bright cities of the old days were still there, still beautiful, still busy, but the age of their independence had passed, and they lived now in the long shadow of the great kingdoms. So the world was carved, and so it settled. And out of all this, out of the conquerors marching and the successors warring, came something none of them had planned. A single broad civilization, Greek in its speech and its style and its habits of thought, spread across an enormous span of land and sea, from the rocky shores of the homeland, across the islands, along the coasts of the east, down to the warm river mouths of the south. The small, bright cities of the old days had become, now, a single great commonwealth of cities, scattered like lamps across all that immense distance, all of them speaking, more or less, one common tongue. That tongue had a name. The Greeks called it koine, the common speech, a smoothed and simplified Greek that travelers and traders and soldiers could use from one end of the world to the other, the everyday Greek of the marketplace and the harbor. A merchant from the homeland could sail to Egypt or to Syria or to the far cities of the east and make himself understood. A scholar could read a letter written 1,000 miles away. It was the first time so much of the world had shared a single language of culture and commerce, and along that language flowed everything else, the gods and the games, the styles of building, the ways of thinking, the love of the beautiful and the orderly that the Greeks carried with them wherever they went. And greatest among the new cities, the brightest of all those scattered lamps, was a place built where a wide river meets the sea, a city of broad straight streets and white colonnades and a harbor crowned by a tall lighthouse, whose great fire burned through the night to guide the ships safely home across the dark water. Alexandria they called it, founded by the conqueror himself on the edge of Egypt where the Nile spreads into the sea, and made great by the Ptolemies who ruled there. Into it flowed the trade and the learning and the wonder of the whole world. Let us linger here in Alexandria, for it was the jewel of the age. The Ptolemies laid it out on a grand plan, with long avenues crossing at right angles wide enough, it was said, for the sun to fill them, with palaces along the shore and gardens and temples, with two great harbors sheltered behind a long causeway that ran out to an island in the sea. And on the tip of that island the kings raised one of the wonders of the world, the Pharos, the great lighthouse of Alexandria, a tower of pale stone rising in 3 stages, square and then 8-sided and then round, climbing hundreds of feet into the sky, taller than almost any building men had yet made. At its summit a fire burned by night, and by day, it was said, a great mirror caught the sun and threw the light far out over the water, so that sailors could see it from many miles away and steer their ships home. For 1,000 years and more it stood, the tallest of the works of men, until at last the slow earthquakes of the centuries shook it down into the sea. But in the age we are speaking of it burned bright over the harbor, the first thing the traveler saw as he came in from the open water, and the very word for a lighthouse, in tongue after tongue, would come from its name. But the true wonder of Alexandria was not the tower of stone. It was a thing built of scrolls and quiet rooms and patient minds. For here in this new city by the sea, the Ptolemies built something that had never quite existed before, a great house of learning, a place they called the Museum, the House of the Muses, where scholars from all over the world were gathered and kept and paid to do nothing but think and read and write. And beside it they built a library that sought, gently and ambitiously, to gather all the books in all the world beneath one roof. Picture the long, cool halls lined with countless scrolls, each in its niche, each holding the careful thought of some far-off mind. Picture the scholars bent over them in the lamplight, reading and copying and comparing, drawing the wisdom of Greek and Egyptian and Babylonian together into one slow, patient river of knowledge. The library grew until it held, by some accounts, hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Ships that came into the harbor were asked courteously to lend their books to be copied. So hungry was the great library for every word ever written. The scribes would copy the borrowed text, and the story goes, keep the original and return the copy. So eager were the kings to possess the real thing. They sent agents abroad to buy up books in every market of the world. It was a dream of holding the whole mind of the world safe in one quiet place. Every poem and play and history and treatise, every word of wisdom men had ever set down, gathered and ordered and kept against forgetting. And in that golden age, gathered in those cool rooms, the mind of the world did remarkable things, gently and without fanfare. This was the great age of Greek science, the age when patient men, freed from worry and given the leisure to wonder, looked hard at the world and the heavens and worked out truths that would stand for 2,000 years. There was a geometer named Euclid who taught in Alexandria in the early days of the Ptolemies, and who gathered up all that the Greeks had learned of shape and number and set it down in a great work he called the Elements, the rules of geometry laid out so clearly, one truth leading to the next, each proven from the last, that students would learn from his pages for thousands of years to come, longer than from almost any book ever written but the holy ones. He built his whole vast structure from a handful of simple statements that no one could doubt, and showed how all the rest followed, with a beauty so plain and so complete that to read it even now is to feel the quiet click of a thing falling perfectly into place. There was Archimedes of the island city of Syracuse far to the west, perhaps the greatest mind of the whole age, a man who worked out how levers lift and how things float upon the water, who measured the circle and very nearly invented, all alone, the mathematics of the curve and the changing thing that would not be fully born for another 2,000 years. He it was, the story says, who leapt up in his bath with a cry of joy at a sudden understanding of why a body sinks or floats, so glad of the discovery that he ran out into the street to tell of it. He devised engines and machines, screws to lift water and pulleys to move great weights, and he is said to have boasted that, given a firm place to stand and a lever long enough, he could move the earth itself. He died at last when soldiers took his city, killed, the story tells, while he bent over a diagram he had drawn in the sand, asking only that they not disturb his circles. There was Eratosthenes, who kept the great library at Alexandria, and who did one of the loveliest things in all the history of thought. He measured the round earth itself, simply by watching how shadows fell in two distant cities, one far to the south of the other, on the same day at noon. He knew the distance between the two places, and he saw that in the one the sun stood straight overhead and cast no shadow, while in the other it leaned a little and the shadows fell at a slant. And from that small difference, with nothing but careful reasoning and a little geometry, he reckoned the size of the whole globe and came astonishingly near the truth, within a few hundred miles of the real measure, a feat that would not be bettered for many centuries. And there was Aristarchus of the island of Samos, who looked up at the wandering stars and dared to think a thought far ahead of his age, that the earth was not the still center of all things, but that it and the other lights moved instead around the sun, turning upon themselves as they went. Few believed him. The idea was too strange, and the evidence of the eyes seemed against it, and it would sleep for almost 2,000 years before another astronomer woke it again. But he had seen it in that bright, clear age, gazing up from a Greek island at the patient wheeling of the heavens. And others after him mapped the stars and the wandering planets and worked out the lengths of the year and the month with a care that still inspires wonder. These were not conquerors. They were quiet people in cool rooms, measuring and wondering, and the world they uncovered was a vast and orderly and beautiful one. And the art of that age grew tender and human too, to match its science. Where the old statues had stood calm and perfect and remote, gazing past you into some serene distance, the sculptors of the Hellenistic age now carved real and breathing people, caught in the midst of feeling and motion, a tired old fisherman bent under his catch, a child laughing, an old woman stooped beneath a basket, a god or a goddess caught in a moment of surprise or grief or struggle, faces full of life. They learned to carve cloth so fine it seemed to cling and flow, to twist the body in motion, to let the marble seem almost to breathe. A few of these works survive, and you may know them even now without knowing their age. On a Greek island there was found, many centuries later, the broken statue of a goddess of love, armless and serene, her drapery slipping from her hips, her calm face turned a little aside, the figure the world would come to call the Venus de Milo, named for the island of Milos where she lay so long in the earth. There's the great writhing group of a priest and his two sons wrapped in the coils of sea serpents, the Laocoon, all straining muscle and open-mouthed anguish, carved with a mastery of the suffering body that astonished the men of later ages who dug it up. And in the city of Pergamon in the west of Asia Minor, the kings of that small, bright realm raised a great altar wrapped all around with a frieze of gods and giants locked in tremendous battle, the figures bursting from the stone, full of fury and motion and the rush of falling and rising, one of the grandest things the chisel ever made. The poets, too, turned in this age from the great old songs of heroes and gods towards smaller and gentler things. They wrote of shepherds in green valleys piping to their flocks, of lovers and their small joys and sorrows, of the quiet pleasures of an ordinary day made lovely by careful attention, a sunlit afternoon, a friend's voice, the cool of evening, the comfort of a familiar room. It was an age that had seen the whole wide world and marched to the ends of it, and come home a little weary and a little wiser, to cherish the gentle and the particular things. So the long, bright afternoon of the Greek world drew on, full and golden and unhurried, for nearly 3 centuries. The lighthouse burned over the harbor at Alexandria, the scrolls slept in their cool niches in the library, the breathing statues stood in their gardens and their temples, the kings ruled their broad kingdoms and warred a little along their borders and patronized their scholars and their poets. The Greek tongue carried Greek thought from the homeland to the Nile to the far rivers of the East, and ancient peoples learned to read it, and old cities took on new Greek names and new colonnaded streets, and the world was, for a long while, one wide and gentle and learned place. But all ages soften and pass, as ages do, and in time a new power rose far to the west and gathered the Hellenistic world, kingdom by kingdom, into its own broad hand. A city by a river in Italy, which had begun as a cluster of villages on 7 low hills, had grown strong and patient and very hard to defeat, and now its armies and its alliances reached out across the sea toward the east. One by one, the great kingdoms came under its shadow. The Antigonid kings of Macedon were beaten in their turn, and their realm made a province. The vast Seleucid east crumbled and shrank and at last was swallowed. And only Egypt, rich old Egypt of the Ptolemies, held on a little longer than the rest, the last of the successor kingdoms still standing, ruled now by a line grown weak and quarrelsome, leaning ever more heavily upon the friendship and the power of Rome. And so we come, at the very end of the long Greek afternoon, to its last and most famous figure, a queen named Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, the last Greek ruler of Egypt, the last sovereign of all that long line of successors that began when the conqueror died in Babylon. She was a woman of great learning and great charm, who is said to have spoken many tongues, and to have been the only one of all her Greek royal house ever to trouble to learn the language of the Egyptian people she ruled. She held her ancient kingdom as long as she could, by her wits and her alliances, binding herself first to one great Roman and then to another, trying to keep Egypt free in a world that had room now for only one great power. But the tide of the age was against her. The last of the old Greek world could not stand against the new Roman one. And when at last her cause was lost and the Roman fleet had won and the soldiers were coming, she chose, the story tells, to die by her own hand rather than be led captive. And with her death, in the year we would call 30 before the Common Era, Egypt passed into Rome, and the long age of the Greek kingdoms came quietly to its close. But nothing truly lovely was ever quite lost. The empire that rose in the west took up the Greek love of beauty and learning and carried it onward in its turn, copied its statues, read its books, learned its geometry, studied with its philosophers, built in the manner of its temples. The conquerors became, in the things of the mind, the pupils of the conquered. The temples and the questions, the measured heavens and the breathing marble, the common tongue and the gathered scrolls, all passed hand to hand down the long quiet stairway of the years, all the way down to you here now in the dark. For everything we have wandered through tonight still lives, gently, in the world you will wake to in the morning. When you measure a circle or trace a proof, or look up at the wheeling stars and know that the earth goes round the sun. When you read a book in a great library or gaze at a statue that seems almost to breathe. When you use a word in any tongue of the West that came down from the Greek, you are touching, without knowing it, the warm, worn stone of those old cities by the sea, the cool halls of Alexandria, the patient minds in the lamplight. They gathered the whole world's wisdom and made it beautiful, those distant sunlit people, and then they laid it all down and went to their rest, as you are going now. So let it all drift away, softly, all of it, the conqueror's grave in Babylon, the carved kingdoms, the great river and the white city, the lighthouse over the dark water, the scrolls asleep in their niches, the breathing marble in the garden, the last queen on her ancient throne. Let the whole wide ancient world fade like the last gold light over distant hills, and let it carry you gently all the way home, out of the old cities, out of the warm dust and the wine-dark sea, back into your own quiet room, your own soft pillow, your own warm and waiting bed. There is nothing more to see tonight, and nothing more to know. You are here now in the dark and the quiet, safe and warm beneath the covers, and your breath is growing slow and deep and even. The long journey is done. The lamps of Alexandria have burned low, and the harbor is still, and the world is at peace, and so are you, and there is nothing left to do but rest. Let your thoughts go soft. Let your body grow heavy and still. Let the last of the light go out gently behind your eyes. And so we let this part of the story rest, and the whole of it with it. There is no need to remember any of it. Let it fade like the last light over distant hills, and let your breath grow slow and even. You are warm, and you are safe, and there is nothing left to do tonight. Sleep well.